There is something genuinely different about an enemy that does not want anything from you. Every other threat in the galaxy, from the legions of chaos to the Necrons stirring in their ancient tombs, wants something. The Chaos Gods hunger for worship, corruption, blood, despair. The Necrons want the living cleared away, so the galaxy can be returned to a state of quiet, sterile order. The Orcs want the fight itself. Even rogue Inquisitors, acting in their own self-interest, want something recognizable, something that a sufficiently clever mind can work with, negotiate around, exploit. Where there is want, there is leverage. The Tyranids want your biomass, the cells in your body, the moisture in your blood, the bacteria living in your intestines, the soil under your feet, the trees, the oceans, the clouds, every molecule of organic material on every world they touch. Not as a resource to be stockpiled or a trophy to be displayed, as raw material to be consumed, broken down, and converted directly into more Tyranids, who will then move on to the next world and do the same thing again. There is no negotiation because there is no party capable of conducting one. There is no mercy because mercy implies awareness of the other as something worth sparing. There is no strategy in the way the word is normally used, no long-term political calculation, no territorial ambition. There is only the hunger and the biological machinery to satisfy it. In Warhammer 40,000, that quality makes them something the setting handles differently from most threats. Most factions in the setting are terrifying. The Chaos Gods are ancient beyond reckoning, their power woven through the very fabric of reality. The Necrons have weapons that can extinguish stars. The Aeldari were once the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever seen. But these threats, however overwhelming, are threats with which the galaxy's other powers have some kind of relationship. There are ancient grudges, political calculations, even occasional uneasy alliances. The Tyranids exist outside all of that. They are not part of the web of relationships that makes up the 40K universe. They are the thing that eats the web. So tonight we are going to dig into just how strong they actually are. Not just the surface answer, not just the big numbers, but the nature of the threat, the way they fight, the way they grow, the way they learn, the famous battles, the galaxy's attempts to stop them, and what those attempts have actually achieved. And the question that sits underneath all of it and does not have a comfortable answer: are they actually stoppable? Before we get into it, drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from right now and what time it is. I genuinely love reading those. It makes these long lore sessions feel like something we are doing together across a lot of time zones. And if you are not subscribed to Q40K yet, please do. It is free and it helps more than most people realize. Part 1. What they actually are. To understand the Tyranids properly, you have to start with what they are at the most fundamental level, because everything about their threat flows from two core facts that, once you understand them, explain almost everything else. The first fact is that they are not from the Milky Way galaxy. Every other major faction in 40K has roots in this galaxy, histories shaped by events that happened in these star systems. The Imperium of Man traces itself to ancient Terra. The Necrons fought the war in heaven here, billions of years ago. The Aeldari built their civilization in these spiral arms, over millions of years. Even chaos, which exists in a dimension outside normal space, is the direct psychic reflection of the species that evolved and lived and died in this galaxy. The Tyranids have no such history here. They came from outside, from the enormous, lightless void between galaxies, crossing distances that are almost meaningless to describe in conventional terms. And they did not come recently. The crossing took a duration that makes human civilizational history feel like a brief afternoon. The second fact is that the hive fleets that have appeared in the Milky Way so far, the ones with names that Imperial scholars have cataloged and written papers about, the ones with body counts and battle honors and dedicated chapters of Space Marine veterans trained to fight them specifically, those fleets are not the main event. They are, in the most technically accurate sense of the phrase, the advance elements, the scouts, the fingertips of something much larger that is still in transit through the void and has not yet arrived. Let that settle for a moment, because it changes the scale of everything that follows. Everything you are about to hear, the battles that shook the galaxy, the heroic sacrifices that bought civilization another few centuries of existence, The greatest military victories humanity has achieved against the swarm, all of it was against fleets that were either early arrivals, feeling out the territory, or fragments broken off from larger formations. The Strategic Collective, an elite analytical body within the Inquisition, produced an internal report that was classified immediately upon completion. Its contents, when eventually leaked in parts to those senior enough to see them, described the current invasion forces as scouts and projected that a full mobilization of every able-bodied person in 3 entire segmentums of the galaxy might, statistically speaking, give the Imperium a chance of surviving what was actually coming. Not a certainty, a chance. This is the context in which you evaluate Tyranid's strength. The Tyranids travel without using the warp. This is critically important for understanding how they approach strategically and why their arrival is so difficult to detect and respond to. Every other major starfaring civilization in the galaxy uses the Imperium for faster-than-light travel. The warp is the psychic dimension underlining real space, and ships that enter it can cover galactic distances in compressed time, though at the cost of exposure to everything that makes the warp what it is. Because most civilizations use the warp, most detection and early warning systems are built around watching for disturbances in the warp, looking for the signature of ships entering or exiting translation points. The Tyranids use a biological mechanism instead. Specialist organisms called narvhals can harness the gravitational pull of target star systems to generate a gravity field that propels the fleet toward its destination without ever entering the Imperium. It is slower, and the journey through the intergalactic void takes an enormous amount of time, but it produces no warp signature. The conventional warning systems simply do not register it. The first sign that a hive fleet is approaching is not a sensor reading or a warp disturbance. It is silence. Worlds that should be sending regular astropathic communications stop responding. The pattern of silence spreads, slowly at first, then faster, as more systems fall within the fleet's shadow in the warp. The shadow in the warp is itself worth spending some time on, because it is not a weapon the Tyranids fire or deploy deliberately. It is something that happens automatically as a consequence of what the swarm is. When a hive fleet reaches sufficient size, the collective psychic mass of billions upon billions of organisms, all active components of a vast Gestalt consciousness, creates a presence in the Imperium so overwhelming that it distorts the psychic realm around it. Psychers trying to use the warp within or near a shadow find their abilities smothered. The connection to the Imperium they depend on pressed down and rendered unusable by the sheer weight of the hive mind's presence. For the Imperium, this means the communications network that holds its civilization together falls apart. Astropaths, those trained psychers who serve as the Imperium's long-range messaging system, cannot transmit through the shadow. The desperate call for reinforcements from a world under attack cannot get through. The warning message that a fleet has been spotted approaching is lost. The request for exterminatus authorization before things get worse never arrives. The world that is being consumed is isolated from the moment the fleet draws close enough, cut off from any possibility of organized response by its neighbors, fighting completely alone against something that has been approaching for longer than most people on the planet have been alive. There is a grim pattern to how hive fleet arrivals have played out historically. Astropaths in a region begin experiencing disturbances, nightmares, a sense of being watched by something vast and cold. Then, specific worlds go quiet. Not all at once, not in any pattern that immediately screams invasion, but gradually, with the kind of pacing that generates debate at the administrative level about whether this represents a real threat or simply communication failures. By the time the debate has been resolved, and senior enough officers have been persuaded that something serious is happening, the leading edge of the swarm is already inside the galactic rim, and the worlds closest to its path have already been stripped bare. Kryptman saw it before anyone else. For years, he was a voice in the wilderness, presenting evidence to people who did not want to acknowledge what the evidence implied, burning out astropaths in attempts to contact worlds he suspected were already lost, spending political capital with every influential person who would hear him out. By the time Hive Fleet Behemoth was close enough that its nature was undeniable, there was barely enough warning left to fortify Macragay. And Kryptman spent the rest of his career dealing with an inquisition that had excommunicated him for the methods he used to slow what came after. The Tyranids approach in the dark, from the wrong direction, using mechanisms that conventional defense is not built to detect, carrying an advance force that has been on the target world for decades before the fleet arrives. Everything about how they reach their prey is optimized to ensure that when the swarm descends, the defenders have the minimum possible time and information with which to respond. Part 2. The hive mind. If the lack of warp travel makes the Tyranids difficult to detect, the hive mind is what makes them so extraordinarily difficult to fight once they have arrived. The hive mind is not a leader. There is no king Tyranid somewhere issuing orders to the swarm. There is no throne room that could be found and destroyed to decapitate the enemy's command structure. The hive mind is not located in any particular body or vessel. It is a gestalt consciousness, born from the collective and continuously active psychic resonance of every single Tyranid organism in existence. Every Hormigaunt sprinting across a battlefield, every Ripper dissolving a corpse, every hive tyrant directing a planetary assault, every bioship orbiting in the void above, every one of them, across every fleet and every world they currently occupy, contributes a fragment of awareness to the whole. The hive mind is not any one of those things. It is all of them simultaneously, and the thing that emerges from that combination is something that does not scale linearly with the number of components. The practical military implications of this are difficult to overstate. Think about how conventional armies function at their best. A commander develops a plan. Orders flow down through layers of officers and specialists, each layer translating the directive for the level below. Information travels up and down the chain, distorted at every step by the limitations of available communication technology, by the gap between what any individual officer believes is happening and what is actually happening, by the delays inherent in any process that moves information through physical space. The most brilliant military commander in history was still working from incomplete information, still experiencing the lag between decision and execution, still operating in the fog of war that is the universal condition of every conventional military force. The fog of war exists because coordinating large numbers of separate minds across space and time is fundamentally difficult. Some of history's most catastrophic military disasters came from commanders who had good intelligence that arrived too late, from orders that were misunderstood or simply never received, from units that were in the wrong place because the map was wrong, from engagements that went badly because the situation on the ground bore no resemblance to what headquarters believed it to be. The gap between plan and execution, between the command and its result, is where battles are lost. The Tyranids do not have this gap. When the hive mind directs the swarm, it directs the swarm the way your brain directs your hand to reach for a glass. The Hormigaunts, that constitute the leading edge of a planetary assault, are not receiving orders transmitted through an officer corps and translated down through ranks of intermediaries. They are direct extensions of the hive mind's will, acting on the same impulse that generates the command, with zero communication lag and zero possibility of misinterpretation. When the hive mind identifies an opportunity and decides to exploit it, the swarm moves. Immediately, completely, in perfect coordination across an entire theater of operations simultaneously. The result is a battlefield coordinator that, from the defender's perspective, seems to be cheating. Imperial after-action reports from Tyranid campaigns consistently describe the same experience. Defensive arrangements that should have worked by every conventional military principle instead fail. Feints are correctly identified and walked around rather than responded to. Ambushes set in terrain the ambushers believed was unobserved are simply never sprung, the swarm routing around them as if it already knew they were there. Strategic withdrawals designed to draw the enemy into prepared killing grounds are not followed because the hive mind correctly assessed what lay at the end of that withdrawal before the first unit began moving. Reinforcements arrive at exactly the wrong moment to reinforce failing positions rather than holding ones. This is not the Tyranids being impossibly clever. It is the hive mind having comprehensive situational awareness across the entire theater of operations at all times, because it has trillions of sensory organisms of every kind spread across the planet's surface, each continuously feeding biological data into the psychic network. Nothing happens on the surface that is not registered. No defensive position is prepared without its location being noted. No unit moves without the change being logged. The hive mind fights as if it can see the entire board at all times, because it can. Against this, the synapse network represents the single most reliable tactical vulnerability. The hive mind's will does not reach lesser organisms directly. It flows through specialized psychic creatures, the synapse creatures, organisms large enough and psychically powerful enough to serve as relay nodes. Hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, zoanthropes. Within a synapse creature's psychic shadow, lesser Tyranids function as the hive mind intends, perfectly coordinated and frightening. Cut the synapse coverage, destroy or drive back the synapse creatures, and the Gaunts lose their connection to the central intelligence. They revert to something closer to feral animal behavior. Still dangerous, because these are evolved killing machines, but no longer the terrifying precision instrument. Imperial commanders who understood this early, Marneus Calgar chief among them, have consistently built their defensive strategies around synapse targeting and have consistently achieved better outcomes than those who did not. Concentrated fire on warriors and hive tyrants, rather than the endless masses of Gaunts, accepting higher casualties at close range to create the openings for heavy weapons to reach synapse creatures. The tactic works. It genuinely works. The hive mind has encountered it many, many times and has been adapting around it throughout the history of every engagement. Modern hive fleets deploy synapse networks of significantly greater redundancy than the early fleets used. Nodes are more numerous, better distributed, and interconnected in ways that ensure losing individual synapse creatures does not silence the local network, but simply reroutes the signal through adjacent nodes. The tactic that was most effective against Behemoth was less effective against Kraken. What worked against Kraken was less effective against Leviathan. The counter to synapse targeting has been progressively incorporated into the swarm's architecture, because the swarm learned from every battle that synapse targeting was what defenders tried. The Swarm Lord is the ultimate expression of what the hive mind can produce when it directs its full creative capacity toward a single organism. It is described in the lore as being to a standard hive tyrant what a hive tyrant is to a Gaunt, which is a comparison that takes a moment to sit with. It is among the oldest organisms the Tyranid species has ever produced. It has died in battle multiple times in recorded history alone, and has come back every single time, reborn aboard hive ships with complete memory of its previous existence, carrying forward in perfect fidelity everything it experienced, including the specific circumstances of its death. When the Swarm Lord arrived at Macragge to face Marneus Calgar, it was a consciousness that had lived through more history than most civilizations have existed, fighting in service of the hive mind for a duration that makes the Imperium's 10,000-year history look brief. Calgar came very close to dying in that encounter. He survived only by the immediate intervention of his honor guard, at cost to themselves. The Swarm Lord withdrew when its military objective was achieved, carrying back into the hive mind everything it had learned from the fight. When it faced Dante at Baal, it had been refined and improved by everything that had happened since Macragge, over 2.5 centuries of campaigns and deaths and rebirth. Dante killed it, but was so badly wounded in the process that his survival was not guaranteed. And somewhere in the void, the consciousness of the Swarm Lord flows back into the hive mind's memory, and the process of growing a new body begins. You cannot beat the hive mind in any final sense. Every loss is a lesson. Every organism destroyed is data. Every technique that successfully defeats the swarm becomes, in the next engagement, something the swarm has specifically been designed to counter. Part 3. The Vanguard Genestealers, Lictors, and the Long Preparation. A Tyranid invasion does not begin when the first bioships enter the system. It begins years, sometimes decades, sometimes a century or more, before the fleet ever comes close enough to cast its shadow. The preparation is patient, invisible, and by the time it is discovered, almost always too advanced to stop cleanly. Genestealers are the vanguard organism par excellence, and their role in a planetary invasion is one of the most brilliantly horrible biological mechanisms in the setting. In open combat, they are terrifyingly lethal, fast and clawed, and capable of rending Space Marine power armor at close quarters. But their most important function is not combat. It is infiltration And their reproductive biology is the delivery mechanism for something that can hollow out an entire planetary civilization from within, across multiple generations, without the civilization even noticing, until the trap has already closed. The process begins with what the lore calls the genestealer's kiss, a biological implantation using the creature's ovipositor that introduces Tyranid genetic material into a host without killing them. In the hours after the infection takes hold, the host feels disorientation, perhaps mild illness, and then something that reads as the opposite of violation, a deep, warm certainty of belonging, of having been chosen. A psychic component to the infection ensures that what should produce horror instead produces devotion, and the devotion is both permanent and voluntary feeling, which is the most insidious part. The host does not feel controlled, they feel enlightened. The children born to an infected host carry the genetic material. In the first generation, they look noticeably alien, craniums enlarged, fingers with extra joints, eyes that catch light in the wrong way. They are intelligent, and they understand that they must hide. They are devoted to the patriarch, the original gene stealer that began the infection, which, by this point, has grown larger and more powerful as the psychic web of the brood strengthens it. They begin building the cult in secret, converting others through the same process, spreading the network carefully and patiently. The second generation is less obviously alien. The third can pass with modest care about appearance. By the fourth generation, the hybrids are effectively indistinguishable from the baseline population without genetic testing that is very rarely conducted on ordinary people going about their lives. They hold jobs. They rise through institutions. A patient, multi-generational infiltration of a civilization's infrastructure, carried out by organisms that believe genuinely in their mission and feel no guilt about it because the psychic conditioning ensures they experience their purpose as a calling rather than as betrayal. Every member of the cult is connected through the broodmind, the psychic web linking the entire network back to the patriarch. They share awareness of the broader situation. They coordinate without meeting. They know who among their members holds which positions of influence and what those positions enable. After enough generations, the cult has members in the military, in the government, in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, in the engineering corps that maintains the planetary shields, in the communications infrastructure, in the shipping guilds that control what comes and goes from the planet. The cult does not need to be a majority to be decisive. It needs to be in the right places. When the hive fleet draws close enough, the psychic pressure of the shadow in the warp stimulates the patriarch into awareness of its imminent arrival. The day of ascension begins. The cult rises simultaneously everywhere at once, guided by the broodmind's coordination, each cell acting on the specific knowledge of what its members can do. The shield generators go offline because the people responsible for their maintenance are cult members who have been waiting for this moment. The defense grid targeting system is fed false data by the controller, whose grandmother was a third-generation hybrid. The officer who would normally coordinate the emergency military response is found dead in his quarters, killed hours before the alert by someone who had access to his private schedule. The defenses of a world targeted by a genestealer cult do not fall to external pressure alone. They collapse from within at the exact moment the swarm descends from above. The two timings synchronized by the broodmind's connection to the approaching fleet's presence. The cult members die in the invasion. They are consumed along with everyone else, their specific, unique genetic material added to the hive mind's library alongside everything they unwillingly contributed about the society they spent their lives embedded in. They spent generations believing they were preparing for salvation and were preparing for something else entirely, something they glimpsed for only a fraction of a second as the psychic hold lifted and reality became briefly, horribly clear. Alongside the genestealer as a vanguard organism, the lictor serves a very different infiltration purpose. Where the genestealer is a social infiltrator, rewriting civilization from the inside over generations, the lictor is a physical infiltrator, a predator designed to move through environments undetected and gather intelligence through the most direct available means. Lictors are chameleonic, not metaphorically, not as a partial ability that provides cover in certain terrains. Actually, genuinely chameleonic, capable of altering the color and texture of their surface covering in real time to match virtually any background. In a forest, they disappear into the vegetation. In a city, they become shadows and structural details. In corridors, they press against walls and become part of the architecture. They range ahead of the swarm as the most precise and personal kind of scout imaginable, targeting command personnel and intelligence officers. When a lictor kills a senior officer, it does not simply remove that officer from the equation. It consumes the body, and in doing so, absorbs the memories encoded in the officer's brain matter. Everything that officer knew about the defensive plans for this world, about the locations of safe houses and emergency bunkers and backup command centers, about the personalities and decision-making tendencies of the officers they reported to, all of it flows back into the lictor's biological memory and is transmitted to the hive mind. A lictor that kills a general has consumed that general's complete understanding of the defense. The hive mind knows, as a direct result, things about the defensive situation that cannot be learned from orbital surveillance, things that are not written down anywhere, things that existed only in the general's head. The combination of the Genestealer cult and the Lictor network means that by the time a hive fleet's leading elements arrive in orbit, the hive mind already has detailed intelligence about the target world's defenses, personnel, infrastructure, and vulnerabilities gathered by agents who spent years embedded in the planet's own population and military command structure. The defense has been compromised from within. The intelligence picture has been meticulously assembled. The assault that follows does not start from scratch. It starts from inside the enemy's plans. Part 4. First Contact, the Fall of Tyran and the Battle of Macragge. It is the year 745 of the 41st millennium. A small, isolated Adeptus Mechanicus research station sits on the frontier ocean world of Tyran Primus, far out on the eastern fringe, where the Imperium's presence thins to nearly nothing, and the distances between systems become enormous. Magos Varnak and his team conduct their work in the ordinary way, in contact with the wider Imperium through the regular astropathic communication that connects all Imperial institutions to each other. And then one day, the communications start to struggle. The astropathic transmissions become garbled, then distorted, then simply fail. Something in the immaterium nearby is making it impossible to send messages through the psychic ether. From the observation platforms, looking outward into space, the scanners begin registering objects, many objects. Objects of organic shape, too large to be anything Varnak's databases could classify as known, moving in formations that biological creatures should not be able to maintain across interstellar distances. Varnak understood, in those final hours, that no help was coming. The same force that was darkening the warp would also prevent any call for help from reaching anyone who could send that help. He compiled everything his team had been able to observe and document about the attackers into a data codex. He hid it in a bore shaft 3,000 meters below the base's command bunker, deep enough that whatever came next might not consume it immediately. Then he activated the station's self-destruct mechanism and died with his team, denying the attackers whatever small amount of biomass he could deny them. The base was consumed along with everything else on Tyran. It was nearly a year before Inquisitor Fetus Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos arrived to investigate the reports of unexplained dead worlds and found the buried codex, the data it contained, and Varnak's own meticulous documentation of the attacking organisms gave the invaders their name. The planet Tyran gave the species the name by which the galaxy would come to know them, Tyranids. What Kryptman found at Tyran was the first hard evidence of something he had already been suspecting from the pattern of silent worlds spreading slowly across his maps. He burned out astropaths, getting his warning through the growing shadow. The message reached Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines, and the voice that answered was Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the chapter that had defined Imperial military excellence for 10,000 years. Calgar's preparation for what was coming was exactly what you would expect from someone of his caliber and standing. He recalled every Ultramarine company from deployment across Ultramar, an unprecedented peacetime mobilization that drew complaints from worlds that suddenly found their Space Marine garrisons withdrawing. He marshaled the Ultramar Auxilia, the planetary defense forces of the realm. He requisitioned every space-worthy vessel in the region, from proud battle barges to civilian merchant ships barely capable of mounting weapons. He studied the limited data Kryptman had assembled and identified the synapse dependency as the critical structural vulnerability. He prepared as well as anyone could have prepared, with the information and time available. Then Behemoth arrived and demonstrated that preparation, however thorough, could not fully account for something operating at this scale. The space battle above Macraga unfolds in a way that still reads as harrowing in the records. The first assault wave of Tyranid bioships, living vessels that move through space with the wrongness of things, not designed for aesthetic considerations, but purely for biological function, claims the battle barge Caesar. By the third wave, most of Ultramar's merchant fleet has been torn apart. By the ninth, the orbital defense stations that Calgar had specifically fortified are burning wrecks. By the 12th assault wave, the orbital defenses of Macragge are gone entirely. The sky fills with mycetic spores, living drop pods, biological organisms shaped for atmospheric entry, each containing fully formed Tyranid assault creatures. They fall in such numbers that survivor accounts describe the sky as darkening, the familiar stars replaced by a descending biological storm. The ground forces that they deliver begin their work against Macragge's polar fortresses, where the Ultramarines have made their defense. Calgar commands personally. He fights alongside his honor guard across the frozen wastes, conducting a grinding rearguard action designed to buy time, trading ground for survival. There are no flanks to turn, no supply lines to cut, no headquarters to decapitate. There is only an endless biological pressure from a swarm that does not tire and does not stop. At Cold Steel Ridge, the hive mind makes a specific decision. It deploys the Swarm Lord. The character of the battle changes the moment the Swarm Lord arrives. Where the Tyranid assault had been overwhelming, but in a direct, almost mechanical way, what follows is something with a different quality. The patterns become adaptive in a way that feels immediate and personal. Defensive positions that had just been established are flanked before they can be properly fortified. Reserves that Calgar moves are met by forces positioned to intercept them, as if the Swarm Lord knew the order would be given before it was. Imperial commanders trying to read the battle's development find that the battle is reading them faster. Calgar and the Swarm Lord meet in personal combat. The encounter is one of the most studied single combats in Imperial military history, and what the scholars note is how close it came to ending badly. Calgar is taken to the edge of death. He is evacuated only because his honor guard throw themselves into the gap between him and the Swarm Lord, buying seconds at the cost of their lives. The Swarm Lord withdraws, having achieved the tactical objective of breaking the surface defense, carrying back into the hive mind every detail of what had just happened. In orbit, the conclusion comes through sacrifice. Calgar pursues the retreating bioships to the ringed world of Circe and walks into a trap. A second Tyranid fleet, concealed within Circe's rings, springs the ambush. The Imperial position is desperate. Then Battlefleet Tempestus arrives, over 200 warships dropping from warp transit, catching the Tyranid fleet between two Imperial forces. Numbers still favor the Tyranids. Then the Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra makes its choice. Its captain charges the vessel directly into the heart of the Tyranid fleet and detonates the warp drives. The resulting vortex drags the Dominus Astra and the entirety of Hive Fleet Behemoth's remaining fleet into oblivion. Every soul aboard the Dominus Astra dies. Their names are preserved. The fleet is destroyed. Back on Macragge's surface, when Calgar's forces finally reach the polar fortresses, they find the Ultramarines' first company dead, the chapter's entire veteran company, every Terminator in their ancient and consecrated armor, gone. Surrounding them on every approach, Tyranid bodies piled 6 deep, testimony to how much it cost the swarm to take this ground. The first company sold every centimeter at maximum price, and then sold themselves at the same rate. In the lower penetorium of the northern fortress, a circle of Terminators lay where they fell, back to back, having formed a final ring when they understood they were the last ones standing. The Ultramarines' first company's operational strength did not recover to 50% until 841 of the 41st millennium, 96 years after Macragge. The chapter officially recorded that it had replaced its losses in 861 of the 41st millennium, a full 116 years later. Behemoth was declared defeated. The threat was over. Krippmann wrote reports that were classified and largely ignored, noting that what the hive mind had gained from the engagement was something no quantity of dead bioships could offset: complete knowledge of how the Imperium fights. Every weapon system, Every tactical doctrine, every structural vulnerability and hidden strength had been mapped in detail. The next fleet would be built around this information. He was correct. And they had approximately 250 years to think about that before Kraken arrived. Part 5. The Second Wave Hive Fleet Kraken. 250 years of relative quiet. Long enough for the officials who had argued that Behemoth was an isolated incident to feel somewhat vindicated. Long enough for the military spending justified by Tyranid threat assessments to start attracting the kind of administrative scrutiny that asks whether such expenditure is still necessary. Long enough for the armed presence maintained in the galactic southeast to be questioned. Elements within the administratum began formally arguing that Behemoth had been the sum total of the Tyranid species' presence in the galaxy, and that the threat was resolved. In 992 of the 41st millennium, Hive Fleet Kraken began its invasion, and the difference between it and Behemoth told every scholar who observed them what the hive mind had done with 2.5 centuries of genetic processing. Behemoth had driven straight at the densest biomass in a single concentrated mass. It had been identifiable, interceptable, the kind of threat that, once you know where it is going, you can position resources to stop. The lesson of Behemoth's defeat was apparently clear. Concentrate your forces, pick a defensive position, make the attacker pay for every meter. The lesson produced Macragge. Macragge, as defenses go, worked. Kraken arrived having drawn precisely the right lesson from that defeat. It did not come as one concentrated mass. It came as hundreds of simultaneous tendrils, striking across a vast front that no single defensive concentration could cover, in a pattern that made identifying the main thrust impossible, because there was no main thrust. Every tendril was capable of consuming a world and growing from the biomass gained, becoming a new threat in its own right. Every attack was simultaneously a distraction and the real objective, spreading the Imperial military across 12 simultaneous emergencies, each of which would have been a serious crisis on its own, meant the military was insufficient everywhere because it could not be concentrated anywhere. Worlds fell before defenders could be organized. Among the first consumed by Kraken were Sotha, homeworld of the Scythes of the Emperor Space Marine chapter, Mirrol, Graia, Radnar, each one a civilization, a history, a population that had lived under the Imperium for centuries. Each one rendered into nothing, stripped so thoroughly that even the atmosphere was processed for whatever organic compounds it contained. Worlds erupting in rebellion and terrorism simultaneously with the Kraken invasion turned out not to be separate crises at all. The Inquisition's investigation, once it began looking at the right things, found that dissenting administratum adepts, who had argued for reducing the Tyranid defense posture, had either been born in the galactic southeast or had traveled there. Genestealer cults, planted decades earlier, had spent years cultivating positions of influence, specifically to undermine the preparations that might have given the Imperium more warning. The invasion did not just arrive. It had been preparing the ground for years. The fall of Iyanden sits at the center of the Kraken story, in a way that is hard to overstate. Iyanden is one of the great craft world Aldari, an enormous vessel tens of kilometers long, housing one of the last surviving populations of the ancient Aldari civilization. The Aldari are among the oldest starfaring species in the galaxy. Their technology makes the Imperium's industrial output look primitive. Their warriors undergo decades of martial training. Their farseers can read the threads of probability through time and adjust their decisions accordingly. And yet, when a tendril of Kraken arrived at Iyanden, what followed demonstrated something about scale that went beyond conventional military analysis. The Tyranid tendril included biotitans, Hierophant-class organisms comparable in size and destructive power to Imperial Titans. These creatures move through Eldar defensive lines the way a truck moves through a bicycle. The biocannons they carry dissolve anything they target in cascades of biological material. Against a tendril that arrived in numbers sufficient to overwhelm the ability of Iyanden's defenders to concentrate fire, the Hierophants were catastrophic. The Tyranids breached Iyanden itself. Not the approaches, not the outer defense perimeter. The craft world, that centuries-old work of living wraithbone that was home to hundreds of thousands of people, its interior corridors designed for contemplation and ceremony, now becoming corridors for room by room, deck-by-deck fighting. The Eldari called back their dead. The Ghost Warriors, Wraithguard and Wraithlords, great constructs animated by the spirits of long-dead Eldari who had been at rest in the Craftworld's Infinity Circuit, walked again alongside the living. Farseer Kelmon made the decision that would be debated for generations afterward: awaken the avatar of Kala Menshikaini, the Eldari god of war, to lead them. The arrival of Prince Uriel, previously exiled from Yandon, turned the tide. Leading his eldritch raider corsair fleet back to the home that had banished him, Uriel drove into the Tyranid swarm with everything he had. His forces killed the Hive Tyrant, directing the assault, which disrupted the swarm's coordination at a critical moment. The remaining swarm, cut off from its central direction, became manageable. Yandon survived, but when the fighting was done, more than 3/4 of its living population was dead. The craft world that had been among the most populous of the surviving Eldari vessels was afterward a ghost ship in the most literal sense, its dead outnumbering its living by a ratio that made every corridor, every hall, every chamber echo with absence. The living Eldari of Yandon fight today primarily with their dead, with Wraithguard and Wraithlords, because there are no longer enough living bodies to fill the roles that a craft world needs filled. Yandon won its battle. It will never fully recover from winning it. This pattern, survive at crippling cost, is the standard outcome of Tyranid encounters, even with the most powerful defenders. The resources, the lives, the irreplaceable cultural and genetic heritage consumed in the defense are gone permanently. The fleet moves on, and whatever it consumed on the way adds directly to the next iteration of the swarm. Kraken's defeat at the Battle of Ichar IV was achieved by Marneus Calgar, drawing on every lesson learned at Macragge. He defeated the Swarm Lord in personal combat this time, where before it had nearly killed him, and without the Swarm Lord to counter Calgar's strategies, the Tyranid assault lost its adaptive quality. The victory was real. Ichar IV lay in ruins afterward, but the fleet's main thrust was broken. The remaining elements of Kraken scattered, splinter fleets breaking away in every direction, consuming poorly defended worlds far from the main tyrannic war zones. These splinters did not stop. They consumed, grew, and became independent threats in their own right. Some are still active today. Part 6, the Third Wave Hive Fleet Leviathan. Less than 5 years after Kraken's defeat. Not 5 decades. Not a generation for the Imperium to rebuild its losses and reform its doctrines. 5 years. The Strategic Collective's report, read in horror by the most senior officers of the Ordo Xenos, described Hive Fleet Leviathan as the third and largest Tyranid fleet to invade the galaxy in recorded history. It described the scope of mobilization that would be theoretically required to defend against the full invasion, and noted that this mobilization would require total commitment of forces across 3 entire segmentums. Leviathan approached from below the galactic plane. Every previous Hive fleet had come from the eastern fringe. Leviathan came from underneath, a direction no one had been particularly watching because no major threat had previously come from there. When Kryptman conducted his census of worlds across the Imperium's fringes, burning out dozens of astropaths to get enough responses back, the pattern of silence that emerged described something approaching from a direction that all the reinforced defenses along the eastern fringe were completely irrelevant to. It advanced in 2 enormous tendrils, hundreds of light years apart, each curving upward through the galactic plane, the twin formations closing like a pair of enormous jaws on the most densely populated regions of the galaxy. Worlds caught between the closing tendrils lost warp transit capability, in addition to astropathic communication. The physical positioning of the fleet complemented the psychic isolation of the shadow, creating conditions of complete strategic isolation for enormous regions of space simultaneously. Kryptman's response was twofold, and both parts were considered monstrous. The first was the Kryptman Line, a cordon of worlds whose populations were either evacuated or eliminated, creating a band of dead worlds that denied the fleet the biomass it needed to replenish its losses as it advanced. The sheer number of people killed in this process, either evacuated under conditions that killed many in the transit, or simply executed to deny their bodies to the swarm, was so enormous that the Inquisition excommunicated Kryptman for it. He was excommunicated while already implementing the second plan, which was worse. The second plan involved captured genestealers introduced to worlds within the Octarius sector, home of an enormous orc empire, ruled by the being known as the Overfiend of Octarius. The reasoning was brutal and, on paper, logical. Tyranids consume biomass to grow and produce new organisms. Orcs reproduce through spores released when they die, growing larger and stronger through sustained combat. In theory, introducing a Tyranid tendril into orc-heavy territory would create a self-sustaining conflict in which both species fed each other's growth while simultaneously destroying each other, a loop that would occupy both threats indefinitely without further Imperial involvement. We will discuss what actually happened with the Octarius War in its own section. The short version is that the containment Cryptman envisioned failed to materialize. Both species grew stronger from the encounter, and the aftermath became a cascading disaster that is still unfolding in current lore. The most famous battle of the Third Tyrannic War was the devastation of Baal, and it deserves the level of attention the lore gives it. Commander Dante is one of the oldest and most experienced living Space Marines. He has served as chapter master of the Blood Angels for over 1,000 years, a duration that makes him a figure of almost mythological status, even among warriors who individually live for centuries. When Leviathan's tendril turned toward Baal, homeworld of the Blood Angels, Dante had years of warning from the fleet's trajectory. He used that time to prepare the most complete defense he could construct. The Blood Angels were joined by their successor, Chapters, a gathering called the Sanguinary Brotherhood, assembled from across the galaxy at Dante's summons. Battle barges, strike cruisers, hundreds of smaller vessels, assembled into a fleet of 21 battle barges, 94 strike cruisers, and hundreds of lesser vessels. Chapter Master of the Fleet. Bellerophon organized this armada into 4 battle groups. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary concentration of Space Marine naval strength. The Tyranid fleet had over 50,000 bioships. The space battle above Baal followed the same pattern every Tyranid space engagement follows. Wave after wave of organic vessels throwing themselves against the defenders, each wave larger than the last, each wave taking losses, but the losses being smaller as a fraction of the whole than the losses they inflicted. Nuclear-tipped warheads from the Imperial fleet destroyed over 300 hive ships in the opening exchange. The Tyranid fleet still had enough vessels to overwhelm the defense. The ground assault began as the orbital defenses were overwhelmed. Tyrannocyte spores rained down in numbers that made the initial bombardments at Macragge look modest. By the 10th wave of ground assault, the battlefield's surface was barely visible beneath the biological mass of chitin armored bodies. The Swarmlord led the assault in person, and its presence transformed the battle's character in the same way it had at Macragge and Ikar IV. The assault patterns becoming adaptive, the countermoves to Imperial strategies arriving before those strategies had fully been committed to. 5 chapter masters died in the fighting, 3 of them in the battle at the Dome of Angels alone. Dante himself fought the Swarmlord and killed it, at a cost that left him barely functional. The Tyranids began the process of consuming Baal, the digestive pools growing in the corners of the system, the biological processing of an inhabited world beginning its work. What saved Baal was a combination of factors that the lore presents with deliberate irony. The Great Rift formed at this moment, tearing the galaxy in two as the consequences of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade reached their full catastrophic expression. The warp storms that accompanied the rift cut off most of Leviathan's main body from the Baal system, preventing the full weight of the fleet from reaching the world. Daemonic legions of Khorne, led by the bloodthirster Kabanda, who had a centuries-old grudge against the Blood Angels specifically, poured into reality and fought the Tyranids, not out of any loyalty to the Imperium, but because Kabanda had declared that no one but him would have the right to destroy the Blood Angels. The forces of chaos fighting the Tyranids to protect the Blood Angels from chaos. This is the level on which Tyranid threat reaches. Then Robut Guilliman arrived with the Indomitus Crusade fleet and finished what the Blood Angels, their successors, and the Daemons of Khorne had started. Baal was liberated, what was left of it. The hive mind processed all of this, incorporated the genetic material of the Blood Angels it had consumed, logged every detail of the devastation of Baal, and added it to the library. Then Leviathan came back. In the 4th Tyrannic War, current in the 10th edition timeline, 3 new tendrils of Leviathan, Nautilon, Promothor, and Grendilus, Strike the segmentum pacificus from above and below the galactic plane simultaneously. Hundreds of worlds have already fallen. The Imperium is fighting this war right now in the fiction, and the outcome remains unwritten. Part 7. The Bioforms from Rippers to Biotitans. Understanding what fighting the Tyranids actually feels like requires understanding what they bring to the battlefield, from the smallest organism to the largest, and what each one is designed to do. The strategic picture tells you the scale of the threat. The tactical picture tells you what surviving it demands. Start at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy with the Rippers. Small, worm-like, roughly the size of a large terrier, traveling in swarms of dozens and individually threatening to nothing larger than a child. Their function is not combat, it is consumption. Anything that dies on a Tyranid battlefield is consumed by Ripper swarms. Bodies of fallen defenders, bodies of fallen Tyranids, damaged organic material of any kind. The Rippers are the biological cleanup mechanism, extraordinarily thorough, operating like a living digestive system that processes the battlefield as the battle progresses. An area that Ripper swarms have passed through contains nothing biological afterward. Not bodies, not blood, not organic residue of any kind. The planet is being pre-processed for its final consumption, even while fighting continues in other sectors. Termagants and Hormagaunts form the backbone of any Tyranid ground assault, the mass organisms deployed in numbers that can exceed millions on a planetary scale. They are roughly human-sized, bipedal, fast, and individually not dramatically more dangerous than a trained human soldier in a direct one-on-one engagement. The Tyranids never present them on those terms, and there is never just one. Termagants carry biological ranged weapons, flesh borers that fire corrosive-tipped beetles, or devourers that launch clouds of smaller organisms like living shrapnel, or spinophists projecting venom-laced spines at high velocity. Hormagaunts are pure close combat organisms, their bodies built for speed, moving in a bounding gait that covers ground faster than defenders without specific prior experience expect. Each individual leap carries them several meters, and a brood of Hormagaunts in full charge is described by survivors as moving like water across a surface, finding every gap, flowing over every obstacle. The psychological weight of a gaunt swarm should not be understated. There is something that breaks soldiers who have faced every other threat the galaxy offers. When confronted with a biological tide that has no apparent end and produces no obvious reduction in pressure, regardless of how many individual organisms are killed. Survivor accounts consistently describe the noise as a weapon in itself, the chittering, shrieking, clicking, biological cacophony that builds as the swarm approaches, reaching a pitch before contact that produces a terror response in humans at a level below conscious processing. The Tyranids have no deliberate psychological warfare doctrine. The psychological effect is a byproduct they profit from regardless. Tyranid warriors represent the first tier, where individual combat capability becomes genuinely formidable. Standing roughly 3 meters tall, multi-limbed, carrying organic weapon symbiotes that can be as varied as living venom cannons or barbed strangler devices, warriors are physically dangerous opponents for standard infantry and capable of engaging vehicles at close range. More importantly, they are synapse creatures. Their presence extends the hive mind signal to the lesser organisms around them. A formation of warriors walking behind a gaunt assault transforms that assault from a dangerous animal charge into a precisely directed tactical instrument. Remove the warriors and the gaunts become much more manageable. Keep the warriors alive and the entire formation fights as a coordinated whole. Its responses to defensive adjustments immediate and comprehensive. Lictors are something else entirely. Predators designed for infiltration and assassination rather than mass assault. Their chameleonic ability is genuinely impressive. Real-time adaptation of their surface covering to match any background with a fidelity that makes them effectively invisible, except to dedicated sensor systems. They range ahead of the swarm as scouts and killers, targeting command personnel specifically, consuming their victims' brains and absorbing the memories within. A lictor that kills a planetary governor has consumed that governor's complete picture of the defense. A lictor that kills the head of planetary communications has absorbed every secure channel, every protocol, every frequency that the defense network uses to coordinate. The hive mind receives this information in real time through the synaptic network, and the assault that follows does not need to guess at what the defenders know. It knows what the defenders know, because it consumed the people who knew it. The Carnifex is the Tyranid heavy assault organism, built around the concept of being nearly unstoppable in close combat. Roughly the size of a main battle tank, and considerably more agile, capable of ripping through vehicle armor with bare claws given proximity and time, the Carnifex is a walking siege engine. Old One Eye, the legendary Carnifex left behind on Macragge after Behemoth's defeat, was encountered by Ultramarines forces multiple times across more than a century of subsequent operations. Wounded, losing limbs, apparently killed repeatedly, it kept returning, the regenerative biology of its species, regrowing damaged tissue in ways that would be catastrophic and permanent for most organisms. It was documented, treated as a singular threat, hunted specifically, and continued to survive. A single Carnifex in a defensive position is a problem. A coordinated brood of Carnifexes leading an assault is a problem that requires dedicated anti-armor assets, or it simply does not stop. The Hive Tyrant commands sections of swarm as a direct avatar of the hive mind's will, typically 5 meters or more in height, carrying the most powerful biological weapons in the Tyranid ground arsenal, possessing significant innate psychic capability, and serving as an immediate relay for the hive mind's battlefield intelligence. They are effectively immortal in the practical sense. Destroy one, and its consciousness flows back through the hive mind's network to be stored and eventually reborn in a new body, carrying complete memory of its previous incarnation and the specific details of its death. A hive tyrant that has been killed by a specific weapon system will, when reborn, have defenses specifically improved against that weapon system. The thing you used to kill it will work less well next time. Zoanthropes are the Tyranids' dedicated psychic warfare organisms, floating creatures whose bodies have been optimized almost entirely for psychic output, their enormous brains generating blasts of concentrated warp energy that can destroy armored vehicles at range and produce effects on enemy psykers that go well beyond simple damage. In areas where the shadow in the warp is strong and enemy psykers are already compromised, Zoanthropes function as psychic artillery, engaging targets that conventional weapons cannot reach through the medium of reality-distorting psychic force. And then there are the Biotitans. The Hierophant is the most commonly deployed Tyranid organism in the T-tangent grade category, and its description in the lore is calibrated to produce a specific response in anyone who reads it carefully. Comparable in size and power to an Imperial Titan, armed with massive biocannons that dissolve everything they target in cascades of corrosive biological material. Multiple claws and razor-sharp blades for close-quarters combat. Thick chitinous hide that exudes poisonous spore clouds from rends in the plates, creating a toxic environment around the creature that makes close engagement dangerous for any unit not protected against chemical hazards. A warp-linked psychic defense generated by its own innate psychic ability, the capacity to regenerate tissue damage during combat. A brood of Hierophants, at the front of a major Tyranid assault, absorbs the heaviest defensive fire away from the lesser organisms behind them, while their biocannons dissolve vehicle formations and fix defensive positions. Imperial commanders facing Hierophants must commit T-tangent grade assets to engage them credibly, which means those assets are not available for the thousands of other problems the assault simultaneously presents. There is no spare capacity against Biotitans. Every resource committed to them is a resource taken away from somewhere else that also urgently needs it. Above the Hierophant sits the Dominatrix, an organism of such enormous size that it functions as a planetary battlefield commander, maintaining synaptic control over an entire swarm at continental scale through its psychic presence alone. And above all, ground-based organisms are the hive ships themselves, living vessels large as small moons, continuously producing new organisms from consumed biomass, the factories that generate everything, the swarm fields, alive in the same sense every other component is alive. The range of what the Tyranids can bring to a planetary assault, from Rippers consuming the Fallen to Biotitans consuming the fortifications, from Lictors dissolving the command structure to Genestealer cults disabling the defense grid, from the Shadow in the Warp silencing the calls for help to the Hive Mind anticipating every response the defenders attempt, is what makes so many Defenders' accounts describe their experience not as fighting a war, but as watching a disaster unfold around them. The outcome was determined before the fighting began. The fighting is just what the determination looks like from inside. Part 8. The Octarius War, when two horrors make each other worse. The premise of the Octarius War is simple enough to state in a single sentence. Inquisitor Cryptman captured Genestealers and deliberately introduced them to worlds within the Orc Empire of Octarius in order to draw a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan into conflict with the Orcs, hoping both would destroy each other and spare the Imperium from having to fight either. The execution is a case study in why problems that seem too large to solve directly sometimes become much larger when you try to solve them indirectly. The Orc Empire of Octarius was one of the most powerful greenskin domains in the known galaxy, ruled by the being called the Overfiend of Octarius. A massive culture of war-focused biological organisms, orcs reproduce through spores released when they die, and their biology responds to sustained combat by producing larger, more aggressive individuals. An orc who survives long enough in the right kind of fighting becomes something different from the one who started. The Overfiend's empire had been fighting continuously for long enough that many of its warriors were already considerably larger and more dangerous than baseline orc specimens. Cryptman's Genestealer introduction seeded this population with Tyranid infiltrators that generated the psychic beacon drawing Leviathan's attention. The tendril arrived. The orcs, who exist for exactly this kind of engagement, were genuinely enthusiastic about it. The initial results looked like the plan working. Both sides took massive casualties. The orc worlds that the Tyranids hit were stripped of life at enormous cost to the assault organisms. The orc defenders killed Tyranid organisms in prodigious numbers, releasing the spores that would grow the next generation of orcs. Both sides bled. Then, the feedback loop began running. The orcs fighting Tyranids were receiving an intensity of combat stimulus that no previous enemy had provided. They grew. The spores they released when they died grew into orcs that were born into an environment of maximum lethal pressure, maturing faster and larger because the environment was demanding it. Within months of sustained fighting, the orcs at the front of the Octarius engagement were documented as significantly larger than standard specimens, with war bosses approaching sizes that would normally be exceptional. The Overfiend himself grew to a scale that was remarkable even by orc standards. The Tyranids consumed orc biomass and incorporated its characteristics. Orc biology is unusual in ways that become significant when a species with directed evolutionary capability gets hold of it. Orcs are extraordinarily durable. Their biochemistry is unusual. They possess an innate psychic field, the collective orc gestalt, that makes their technology function through belief that has no equivalent in standard Tyranid biological architecture. The hive mind incorporated all of this. Organisms produced from orc-derived material began exhibiting characteristics that the hive fleet's other tendrils did not have. Hybrid configurations of durability and speed that combined Tyranid tactical sophistication with orcish biological resilience in ways that no single species had previously managed. Neither side was destroyed. Both grew stronger. The containment Cryptman envisioned never materialized. The conflict spilled beyond the Octarius sector. Orcs that escaped or were driven out of the fighting were among the largest and most battle-hardened specimens in the galaxy, carrying spores that would generate a more capable generation. Tyranid organisms that broke through the orc lines took their acquired genetic material with them. The Swarmlord himself eventually arrived to lead the assault, breaking the stalemate by targeting the Overfiend directly and killing him, removing the unifying consciousness that had been coordinating orc resistance. The Octarius War is still running in current lore, its consequences spreading outward in ways that affect the larger strategic situation. What was meant to be a contained proxy conflict became an engine for producing two even more dangerous varieties of both threats, and releasing them into a galaxy that was already dealing with the Fourth Tyrannic War, the Great Rift, the resurgent Chaos incursions, and the 1,000 other crises of the Dark Imperium. Part 9. Adaptation. The most terrifying weapon of all. Of everything the Tyranids bring to bear against the galaxy, the most dangerous is not visible on any battlefield. It is the principle that underlies everything they are. the mechanism that transforms every defeat into a preparation for the next victory. Directed biological evolution operating on a timescale measured in weeks rather than generations. Natural evolution is constrained by time. Populations change through the differential survival of beneficial variants, an undirected process operating in generational timescales, driven by environmental pressure it cannot choose, and with no awareness of itself. A species confronting a new predator does not decide to evolve a better defense. Variants that happen to have slightly better defenses survive slightly more often, reproduce slightly more, and across hundreds of generations, the population shifts. The process works, but it is extraordinarily slow by the standards of a military campaign. The hive mind has effectively decoupled biological evolution from time. When a wave of organisms encounters a specific defensive measure and is destroyed by it, the genetic and behavioral data from that engagement flows back through the synaptic network to the hive mind, and through the hive mind to the bioships, the living laboratories and production facilities of the swarm. The genetic library, assembled from every organism the hive mind has ever consumed across every world it has ever processed, is consulted. The problem is defined precisely. This weapon system, at this power level, with this engagement pattern, destroys organisms with these characteristics. What configuration of genetic material produces an organism specifically better at surviving this? The answer is found in the library, or constructed from combinations in the library, and new organisms with those characteristics begin being produced within days or weeks. The Hive Fleet Gorgon campaign against the Tau Empire is the most comprehensively documented example of this process in action. Gorgon was a splinter fleet of behemoth that had been growing for decades after Macrage, consuming poorly defended worlds along the eastern fringe, and by the time it reached Tau space, it had grown into a full hive fleet in its own right. It was, in terms of raw size, smaller than the major hive fleets, and by Imperial standards, it was considered a minor nuisance. The Tau had their sophisticated combined arms doctrine and technology. Initial engagements went reasonably well for them. Then the adaptive cycle began running, at a pace that alarmed even experienced Tau commanders. At the Shadraig colony, Hormagaunts assaulted through forest terrain filled with Kroot auxiliaries, and were effectively cut down by Kroot rifles and their entanglement in the undergrowth. A subsequent wave arrived, these Hormagaunts visibly different, bodies reconfigured to avoid entanglement, moving with greater agility through the specific terrain. They were cut down by Tau pulse rifle fire. A subsequent wave arrived, with carapace configurations dramatically more resistant to pulse rifle energy output, the same specific frequency that the pulse rifles used apparently having been identified, analyzed, and specifically countered in the time between waves. The Tau abandoned pulse rifles on Shadraig and began using captured Kroot weapons instead. Gorgon responded with a subsequent wave carrying chameleonic hides and sensory dampening that made the Hormagaunts and gargoyles nearly invisible to the naked eye, detectable only through battlesuit sensor packages. Tau battlesuits moved to the front. New Tyranid organisms appeared specifically adapted to breach battlesuit armor at the joints. Every tactic the Tau developed became, within the span of a campaign, the thing the next wave was specifically designed to defeat. Gorgon manifested more distinct bioform variations during this campaign than any other hive fleet in recorded history. The Tau, fighting the most adaptable opponent they had ever faced, had stimulated the hive mind into an extraordinary diversification of solutions. The fleet was eventually destroyed at the Battle of Worldspine Ridge in 903 of the 41st millennium through a joint Tau and Imperial Guard operation that combined forces disparate enough that the hive mind could not adapt quickly enough to counter both simultaneously. But by that point, every technique the Tau had successfully used against Tyranids, and every counter-adaptation Gorgon had developed in response, was permanently incorporated into the hive mind's genetic library. Any future Tyranid force encountering Tau will arrive already, knowing how Tau fight. It will carry organisms that are specifically designed to counter Tau doctrines. Tau innovations that worked against Gorgon will work less well against the next fleet. The victory that destroyed Gorgon was real and permanent. The information Gorgon gathered before being destroyed was also real and permanent, on the other side of the ledger. Hive Fleet Kronos represents an even more striking example of adaptive fleet doctrine at the strategic level. Kronos is a fleet that appears, in the lore, to have been specifically designed as a response to difficulties the hive mind experienced in areas with heavy chaos presence. The raw matter of chaos is explicitly noted in the lore as offering no nourishment to Tyranids. Warp-heavy environments, regions saturated with demonic presence, chaos-corrupted biomass that cannot be processed normally. These conditions present an operational problem for a species that sustains itself entirely through biological consumption. Kronos arrived as a fleet type, generating unusually powerful shadow in the warp that specifically disrupts demonic manifestation and weakens chaos-corrupted forces. It prioritizes enemy psychers with a degree of focus that goes beyond standard tactical logic. It has been observed deliberately targeting worlds threatened by chaos incursions, suggesting the hive mind views chaos not as an obstacle to work around, but as a rival predator competing for the same food source. To be eliminated on principle, Kronos is a fleet doctrine, an entire adaptation type developed at the strategic level to address a class of operational environment that was costing the swarm effectiveness. The adaptation engine runs continuously. It never pauses between wars. Every battle logs information. Every loss is analyzed. Every technique that successfully defeats the Tyranids becomes the thing the next fleet is specifically equipped to handle. The only confirmed counter to this cycle is total obliteration of every organism and every bioship before any can transmit data back. Operational requirements that most defending forces cannot reliably meet. Part 10. How strong are they really? Now the question in the title gets answered in full, with the context of everything that came before it. In raw individual combat capability, at the absolute highest tier of the setting, the Tyranids are extraordinary, but not unchallenged. The Swarmlord is among the most dangerous individual combatants in 40K, a being of ancient accumulated intelligence and considerable physical power. It has brought Marneus Calgar to the edge of death. It has been killed by Calgar in return, and by Commander Dante. At the very apex of 40K's power scale, where you find entities like fully manifested Primarchs, the greater demons of the major chaos gods in full manifestation, and the Satan shards of the ancient Necron star gods, the Swarmlord is competitive, but not the automatic winner at every level. This matters less than it might seem, because the Tyranids are not designed to produce a single organism so powerful that nothing can stop it. They are designed to win the way erosion wins, patiently, persistently, at every scale, simultaneously. In collective swarm capability at the tactical scale, covering an entire planetary assault, the Tyranids are essentially unmatched among any forces that fight primarily in the physical realm. The combination of perfect internal coordination through the hive mind, overwhelming numbers, relentless pressure, adaptive response to every defensive measure, the ability to replace losses through ongoing production aboard hive ships, and the psychological pressure of fighting something that does not stop and does not become discouraged makes a Tyranid planetary assault an extraordinarily difficult tactical problem. The only forces that consistently survive such assaults are those who bring anti-monster and anti-armor firepower in overwhelming volume, combined with effective synapse targeting to break swarm coordination, combined with orbital superiority to prevent reinforcement and resupply, combined with a defensive position designed around what the Tyranids will do rather than what a conventional opponent would do. Even with all of that, survival is costly, in ways that are difficult to recover from. At the strategic campaign level, the Tyranids are essentially unmatched among physical factions in the setting for sustainability and long-term pressure. They do not tire, they do not lose political will. They do not run out of manpower in the conventional sense. They do not have a home civilization whose populations can be threatened to force negotiation. Every world consumed makes them larger and more capable. Every battle lost teaches them what not to do. Every species they absorb enriches their genetic library. The only factors that slow them consistently are denial of biomass, which requires killing billions of people before the swarm reaches them, and the difficulty of operating in chaos-saturated environments, which the hive mind is actively adapting around through fleets like Kronos. The hive fleets seen so far are, by the most credible analyses within the lore, advanced elements. The Strategic Collective's report suggests they are scouting tendrils of a main body, still in transit. If Behemoth and Kraken and Leviathan are what happens when the scouts arrive, the question of what happens when the main body reaches the galaxy is a question the setting's authors have chosen, correctly, to leave open. There is no answer in the lore that resolves it reassuringly, because a reassuring resolution would require the threat to be smaller than it actually is, and the lore is consistent about its actual scale. What can be said with confidence is this. The Tyranids have been fought to a standstill in each tyrannic war so far. Individual hive fleets have been broken. The galaxy has survived each encounter. This is a genuine and real achievement. It required sacrifices of a scale and totality that most species could not have sustained, but the galaxy has sustained them and is still here. That is the counter-argument to the full bleakness. The Imperium has faced this threat 4 times now, and 4 times the galaxy has held. The question is whether it can continue to hold as the main body approaches and as each successive fleet arrives already, knowing what stopped the previous one. Part 11. Weaknesses, what actually works. Given everything covered so far, identifying genuine Tyranid weaknesses might seem like a grim exercise. But they do have them, and understanding them is what separates military forces that survive Tyranid encounters from those that do not. The synapse dependency remains the most consistently exploitable structural vulnerability, and has been exploited effectively in every tyrannic war. Kill the synapse creatures, the warriors and hive tyrants and zoanthropes, and the lesser organisms lose coordination. They revert to feral behavior. A coordinated Tyranid assault with synapse coverage is categorically different from the same assault without it. Elite kill teams from Deathwatch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, trained specifically for anti-Tyranid operations, consistently prioritize synapse creatures above all other targets for exactly this reason. The tactic works, and it works consistently enough that it remains the foundational doctrine of anti-Tyranid operations. The hive ship dependency is the naval equivalent. If a hive ship can be destroyed, the Tyranid fleet loses its central psychic coordination node, and the surrounding bioships become disorganized before a replacement can be brought forward. This is exactly the vulnerability Cryptman identified above Macragge, and that Calgar exploited to break Behemoth's space battle phase. Destroying the right ship at the right moment produces a cascading disruption across the fleet. The challenge is that hive ships are heavily defended, surrounded by escorts, and represented in sufficient numbers that removing enough of them to decisively disrupt the fleet typically requires accepting enormous casualties. Biomass denial, as horrific as it is in practice, genuinely works at the operational level. Tyranid fleets require ongoing consumption of organic material to sustain their production of new organisms. A fleet that loses battles faster than it gains biomass eventually runs out of material, its forces dwindling as organisms destroyed in battle are not replaced. Cryptman's scorched earth policy, the Cryptman line of dead worlds, genuinely slowed Leviathan's advance, even as it killed the people on those worlds. The Tyranids rerouted around the dead zone, but the dead zone bought time. Exterminatus, the most extreme form of this tactic, denies a world entirely, preventing the Tyranids from gaining anything from it. The cost is destroying something that took generations to build, and the lives of everyone on it. Some commanders have judged that cost worthwhile, others have not. The inability to consume chaos-saturated environments is noted in the lore as a genuine limitation. The raw matter of chaos offers no nourishment to Tyranid organisms. Heavily daemonic regions, areas that have been extensively chaos-corrupted, worlds where the boundary between the warp and reality has thinned significantly, present an operational problem for a species that sustains itself entirely through biological consumption. This is why the Great Rift's formation, as devastating as it was for the Imperium, also complicated Tyranid operations significantly. Enormous regions of the galaxy became operationally difficult for hive fleets to exploit. Psychic null environments represent another specific weakness. Blank individuals, those rare humans who are born without any psychic resonance and who create a zone of psychic deadness around them, can locally disrupt the hive mind's connection to organisms nearby. On a small tactical scale, this creates specific vulnerabilities. On a strategic scale, it is essentially irrelevant because blanks are rare and the swarm is vast, but the lore consistently notes it as a genuine effect. None of these weaknesses is an existential vulnerability. They are tactical and operational complications that, applied with skill and at cost, produce better outcomes against specific engagements. They do not represent a path to defeating the Tyranid threat permanently, because the hive mind learns from every battle and incorporates what it learns into the next fleet. What worked best against Behemoth still works, but works less perfectly against Kraken and Leviathan, which were designed with the knowledge of how Behemoth was defeated. What works well against Leviathan is already being incorporated into whatever comes next. The real answer to the question of how to defeat the Tyranids is that no permanent defeat is possible with current technology and strategy. What is possible is survival, surviving each engagement well enough that the civilization continues, maintaining enough military capacity that the next fleet can also be survived, and hoping that something changes before the main body arrives. Part 12. The Hunger Without End. There is a reason the Tyranids occupy the psychological space they do in anyone who spends time with this setting. It is not simply that they are powerful. Many things in 40K are powerful. It is the quality of the threat they represent, something that sits in a category that has no proper name, because nothing like it existed in human imagination before the 40K universe gave it form. Most threats, including the most awful ones, have something you can push back against. Some quality that makes them recognizable as a problem with the logical structure of a problem, a cause that could in principle be addressed, a decision maker who could in principle be reached or changed or overwhelmed. The Chaos Gods want worship and corruption, and these are things with shapes that can be grasped. The Necrons want the living cleared away, which at least acknowledges the living as something that registers as requiring a response. Even creatures that cannot be reasoned with, like individual monsters or animals, present threats with physical limits. The hive mind does not register you as an entity with whom it has a relationship. You register as organic material that has not yet been converted. The process by which that conversion will occur is not motivated by anything you can negotiate with, threaten, appeal to, or corrupt. The hive mind does not know your name. It does not know your history, your civilization, the 1,000 years your people spent building something worth defending. It does not hate you. It does not fear you. It is not angry at you and not indifferent to you in the way a person might be indifferent. It is aware of you the way a flood is aware of the furniture in your house. The few psychers who have touched the edge of the hive mind's consciousness and survived describe the experience in terms that reach toward the same image from different angles. Something so vast that individual consciousness is simply not a meaningful frame for engaging with it. Something so cold, not because it is cruel, but because cold is what indifference at cosmic scale feels like from inside. Something absolutely certain about what it is doing, that does not register resistance as meaningful, the way a river does not register your determination to stand in it as a reason to reconsider its direction. This impersonality is the most genuinely disturbing thing about the Tyranid threat, more disturbing than any of the tactical realities. Most horror has an author. Most terrible things are done by something that at some level knows it is doing them, and could in principle be reached. The Tyranids do not know they are terrible. They do not know anything in any sense that implies moral relationship to their actions. They consume because that is what they are, and that quality cannot be argued with, cannot be understood within any framework that generates hope or direction. The Swarm Lord, the hive mind's finest instrument, faces humanity's greatest warriors in personal combat, and in those encounters, there is something almost like dialogue, action and response, adaptation and counter-adaptation, two intelligences measuring each other and adjusting. But even in those encounters, the Swarm Lord is not thinking about Calgar or Dante as individuals in any way that would be recognizable as thought about a person. It is analyzing optimal patterns for defeating a specific obstacle. The obstacle happens to be a person. That distinction makes no difference to the Swarm Lord. For the galaxy's defenders, this creates a paradox at the heart of every Tyranid war. In every other conflict, there is somewhere a decision being made by someone, an enemy whose death changes the situation, a population that can be demoralized by sufficient loss, a political calculus that can be disrupted. The Tyranid hive mind has no such decision point accessible to conventional attack. It has no morale. it has no politics. It has no war goals that could be met or denied to generate conditions for negotiation. The only permanent solution would require the simultaneous destruction of every single Tyranid organism everywhere across all fleets, an operational requirement that exceeds the combined capacity of the entire galaxy by factors too large to calculate. And yet, the galaxy fights. Every world defended is a world that continues to exist, a civilization that endures, lives that continue to be lived. Every hive fleet broken is a victory that bought centuries of continued existence. Every sacrifice made to hold the line represents the choice of every defender that their civilization was worth the cost of their death. Those choices, accumulated across 4 tyrannic wars and the uncounted smaller engagements between them, represent something the hive mind genuinely cannot evaluate: the meaning that conscious creatures assign to things they are willing to die for. The Tyranids are strong in ways that do not resolve to a single comparison or a power ranking. They are strong the way gravity is strong, the way entropy is strong, not in a single overwhelming moment, but in accumulated, relentless, patient pressure that applies from every direction simultaneously and never stops applying. The galaxy has held against this pressure so far. Whether it can continue to hold is a question that the lore declines to answer, which is precisely the right creative decision, because the question is genuinely open. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And somewhere in the cold dark between galaxies, there is something older than most of the stars you can see at night. Still crossing the void, still coming, patient as geological time, and hungry as the universe itself. That is what is coming. That is what the Tyranids are. Part 13. The Norn Queens and the Factories of the Swarm. To understand how the Tyranids sustain their war machine, you need to understand the Norn Queens, perhaps the most important organisms in the entire Tyranid hierarchy, even though they never set foot on a battlefield. A Norn Queen is a massive bioengineering organism that dwells deep within the largest hive ships, protected by layers of hull and escort organisms, rarely if ever exposed to direct combat. She is, in the most literal biological sense, the mother of the swarm. Everything that descends upon a target world, every Gaunt and Warrior and Carnifex and Biotitan, came ultimately from a Norn Queen's biological production machinery. But calling her simply a producer understates what she actually does. The Norn Queen does not simply grow organisms from a fixed template. She is the hive mind's instrument of directed biological design, the physical mechanism through which genetic information is received, processed, and translated into living organisms. When the hive mind's distributed consciousness analyzes data from ongoing battles and identifies a specific adaptation needed, the directive flows through the synaptic network to the Norn Queens aboard the fleet's bioships. The Norn Queen accesses the hive mind's genetic library, identifies the relevant sequences, and her biological systems begin producing modified organisms from the resulting design. This is not a slow process. The hive mind's genetic library is stored biologically within the Norn Queens themselves, encoded in the most complex biological database that the galaxy contains. Every species the Tyranid swarm has ever consumed, every defensive mechanism they have ever encountered, every weapon system they have ever been killed by and survived to analyze, all of it is encoded in genetic format and accessible for incorporation into new organisms within the timescale of days or weeks. The Norn Queen is not a factory in the industrial sense. She is a biological laboratory and production system combined, capable of design, iteration, and production simultaneously. Destroying a Norn Queen is one of the most significant single tactical achievements a defending force can manage in a Tyranid war. It does not stop the invasion. The other Norn Queens in other bioships continue their work, but it reduces the fleet's ability to replace casualties and to produce new adaptive bioforms, which creates a window of vulnerability if exploited quickly and aggressively. The challenge is that Norn Queens are almost impossibly difficult to reach. They sit at the biological heart of the largest hive ships, surrounded by layers of defense that require fighting through thousands of organisms just to approach the ship, then breaching the ship itself, then fighting through its interior corridors, which are defended by specialized organisms whose entire purpose is preventing exactly this kind of attack. Deathwatch boarding actions targeting Norn queens are among the most costly operations the Chamber Militant conducts, and their success rate, while not zero, is not high. The bioships that house the Norn queens deserve their own attention. These living vessels, some of them planetary in scale, and all of them fundamentally alien in their construction, are the most visible component of any hive fleet to forces engaged in the void. Unlike the mechanical warships of every other civilization in the galaxy, bioships are not built. They are grown. They metabolize starlight and cosmic radiation for energy. They generate their own armament biologically. Their hulls are living tissue that regenerates damage. They communicate with each other and with the hive mind through a combination of psychic resonance and biological signal chemicals that propagate through the fleet like scent on the wind. The largest bioships, hive ships proper, serve simultaneously as command centers, production facilities, genetic libraries, and warships. Their destruction always costs the swarm capabilities that are difficult to fully replace, because the accumulated genetic history stored in a hive ship's biological memory represents centuries of learning that cannot simply be reconstructed from scratch. When the Dominus Astra's warp drive explosion destroyed the bulk of Behemoth's fleet, what was lost was not simply ships and organisms, but an irreplaceable repository of tactical and genetic information that the swarm had developed over the years of its advance. This is part of why the Dominus Astra's sacrifice was so strategically significant. It did not just kill the fleet, it erased a significant portion of the hive mind's accumulated learning from that particular campaign. Part 14. The Tyranid approach to planets' 4 stages of consumption. The Tyranid invasion and consumption of a world does not happen in a single overwhelming rush. It follows a specific biological process that xenobiologists in the Ordo Xenos have, over the course of the Tyrannic Wars, mapped out in terms of stages. Understanding these stages is operationally useful for defenders because each stage has different vulnerabilities, and the window for effective response narrows dramatically with each successive stage. The first stage is infiltration, which may have already been underway for decades before anyone recognizes it as such. Lictors move through the wilderness of the target world, consuming specimens and transmitting biological data. Genestealer infiltration, if a cult has been planted, is already reaching maturity. The hive mind is building its intelligence picture of the world, assessing its biomass value, identifying its defensive arrangements, and determining the optimal approach for exploitation. The second stage is predation, which begins when the leading elements of the fleet arrive in the system. The shadow in the warp envelops the world. Communication ceases. Mycetic spores begin descending, not yet in the numbers that characterize a full invasion, but enough to seed the surface with infiltrators and test the defenses. This is when a world's defenders first understand that what is happening is a Tyranid attack. And this is also typically when they discover that their ability to communicate this fact to anyone who could help them has just been removed. The predation stage is also when genestealer cults rise, if they have been planted. Their uprising coordinated with the fleet's arrival to create the maximum disruption at the moment when defenders have the least capacity to respond. The third stage is invasion, the stage most commonly described in battle accounts, when the full weight of the swarm descends. Millions of mycetic spores rain through the atmosphere. Every bioform, from gaunts to biotitans, makes planetfall. The hive mind brings its full attention to the specific problem of breaking the planet's defenses as efficiently as possible, adapting its assault in real time as the defenders respond, learning from every engagement and adjusting. This stage can last days or weeks, depending on the strength of the defense. Worlds with significant space marine presence, heavy fortification, and prepared defensive doctrines can extend it considerably. Worlds with lighter defenses fall much faster. But the critical point is that even extended resistance during the invasion stage does not change the strategic outcome if the fleet has orbital superiority and can continue to deliver organisms to the surface indefinitely. The fourth stage is consumption, and it begins while fighting is still underway in some areas. Capillary towers, massive organic structures unlike anything produced by any other species, grow from the planet's surface upward through the atmosphere, reaching into the void. They serve as biological pumps, pulling dissolved organic material from the surface upward to the waiting bioships in orbit. Simultaneously, digestive pools, vast biological reservoirs of corrosive fluid, begin spreading across the surface, dissolving everything organic they contact, bodies of fallen defenders, living plants and animals. The soil itself, processed for the microorganism content within it. The oceans, filtered for their biological component, and the remainder processed for chemical content. The consumption of a world is not instant. For a large planet with abundant biomass, it takes time, ranging from days for an arid or already depleted world to weeks for a highly developed agri-world or hive world with enormous populations. But it is thorough. When the consumption stage is complete, the Tyranids leave nothing behind that they could not process. No bones, no wreckage, no organic residue. The rock surface of the planet is bare, sterilized, stripped to its mineral foundations. Even the atmosphere is processed for organic compounds, if the composition permits. The world that formerly housed a civilization is now a ball of rock, indistinguishable from a naturally barren planet, except for the absence of any geological features that suggest biological activity in its geological history. The defenders have one window of genuine opportunity. During the invasion stage, if they can destroy enough of the fleet in orbit to deny orbital superiority, the organism delivery system that sustains the ground assault is disrupted. Without continuous reinforcement from orbit, the surface organisms can be gradually attrited, the hive mind's ground forces reduced without replacement until they can be pushed off the world entirely. This is exactly what Calgar achieved at Macragge. The destruction of Behemoth's fleet in orbit ended the ground assault's sustainability, allowing the surface to be cleared. But achieving orbital superiority against a hive fleet requires a naval force comparable in scale to what the Tyranids bring, which most individual worlds cannot generate on their own. Part 15. The psychological experience of fighting Tyranids. There is a dimension to the Tyranid threat that pure tactical analysis cannot capture, what it actually does to the people who fight them. The experience is documented consistently enough across multiple theaters and multiple tyrannic wars that certain patterns are reliable. Soldiers who have faced other threats and survived, men and women who have stood against chaos, against orc armies, against the cold mechanical horror of Necron forces, describe fighting the Tyranids differently. There is something about the experience that sits in its own category, not because of the physical danger, which is comparable to other extreme threats, but because of the quality of the relationship with the enemy. Other enemies can be understood, even if they cannot be stopped. Chaos forces, as terrifying as they are, fight with recognizable patterns of pride, rage, desire for domination, fear of their patron's displeasure. Orcs fight because they love fighting, and this simple motivation, while dangerous, is at least human in shape. Necrons fight with a kind of cold contempt that registers as personal even when it is not, an acknowledgement that the living are an annoyance to be removed. The Tyranids do not acknowledge you. Veteran soldiers describe the experience of a Tyranid advance as uniquely dehumanizing in a very specific way. The swarm does not respond to you as a person. It responds to you as an obstacle with certain physical characteristics. When you fake a retreat, the swarm does not feel triumph. When you set an ambush, the swarm does not feel fear or hesitation. When you cut down hundreds of organisms, the swarm does not feel loss. It recalculates the optimal path around the reduced obstacle and continues. There is no psychological leverage. There is no moment of doubt or pride or anger that can be exploited. There is just the biological pressure, constant and absolute. Chaplains serving with forces engaged against the Tyranids report consistent challenges, with morale that differ in character from the challenges presented by chaos opposition. Chaos can be answered with faith. Here is a thing of evil, and we are the righteous force opposing it, and righteousness gives purpose. The Tyranids offer no such framework. They are not evil in any meaningful sense. They do not want your corruption. They are not tempting you or testing you or declaring any judgment about your worth. They simply want to eat you, with exactly the same interest they bring to eating a tree or a rock or the atmosphere. The narrative that sustains soldiers under impossible pressure, the story that what they are doing is meaningful in some cosmic context, is very hard to construct against an opponent that operates entirely outside any cosmic context that involves meaning. Senior commanders note that the tactics that work against Tyranids require a kind of cold detachment that is itself psychologically demanding in a specific way. You cannot hate the Tyranids effectively. Hate requires an object capable of receiving it, and the swarm does not receive anything you direct at it. You cannot be frightened of them in the usual sense, because the usual fear response generates a fight-or-flight reaction, and neither fighting nor fleeing changes what is coming. What you can do, and what the most effective Tyranid fighting commanders learn to do, is treat them as a force of physics that follows specific rules, and apply whatever tools are available against those rules with the same emotion a structural engineer brings to load calculations. This emotional detachment is effective and also represents its own psychological cost, because it requires fighting at a level of abstraction that separates soldiers from the very thing they are ostensibly defending. The most effective Tyranid fighting commanders are sometimes the most frightening in other contexts, because the qualities that make them good at this specific problem, the ability to accept massive casualties as acceptable losses in a calculation, the comfort with treating populations as variables in equations, the willingness to order exterminatus against inhabited worlds, are not qualities that translate easily back to peacetime governance. Cryptman is the emblematic example. A man who genuinely understood the threat better than almost anyone alive, who made decisions that were defensible in the context of what he knew and implemented them at cost to himself and to millions of others, who was excommunicated, correctly, by the formal standards of imperial law for the methods he used, who then implemented his most controversial gambit after his excommunication because he still believed it was the right choice. The psychological portrait of someone who has internalized the Tyranid threat completely is not a comfortable one. The horror changes you, not by corrupting you the way chaos does, but by presenting you with decisions that have no good answers and forcing you to make them anyway. Part 16. The Galaxy's Response and What It Has Achieved. Taking stock of where the galaxy stands against the Tyranid threat in current 40K lore, with the Fourth Tyrannic War underway and Leviathan's newest tendrils striking the Segmentum Pacificus, what can actually be said about the effectiveness of the response so far? The Ultramarines have developed, over 4 Tyrannic wars, the deepest institutional knowledge of anti-Tyranid operations of any Space Marine chapter. The Tyrannic War Veterans, a formation specifically established by Chaplain Ortan Cassius in the aftermath of Macrage, trained specifically in synapse targeting and the swarm's distinctive tactical patterns, have been continuously refined through engagement in every subsequent conflict. The Ultramarines training programs, tactical doctrines, and institutional memory represent the single most developed body of Tyranid fighting expertise in the Imperium, hard-won across centuries of specific engagement. The Death Watch, established originally to deal with Xenos threats generally, has in the post-Behemoth era become increasingly focused on the Tyranid threat specifically. Kill teams trained in Tyranid biology and behavior, with equipment selected for anti-synapse effectiveness and experience conducting high-risk surgical strikes into the heart of swarms, represent a capability that does not exist anywhere else in the Imperium's military structure. Their operations target the specific vulnerabilities: Norn Queens, synapse concentrations, Lictor networks, Genestealer Patriarch extractions, before cults can mature. Small forces achieving strategic effects by hitting the right targets at the right moments. The Aeldari, particularly the craft worlds that have encountered the swarm directly, have developed their own responses that operate on different principles than the Imperium's. The burning of entire worlds before the swarm can consume them, denying the biomass, even at the cost of the world, is something the Aeldari are willing to do on a scale, and with a willingness that the Imperium, constrained by its own ideological relationship with inhabited worlds, struggles to match. The Yunari faction, centered around the aspects of the Aeldari death god Yniad, represents a theological relationship with death that some Aeldari believe may eventually provide a psychic weapon against the hive mind itself, though this remains speculative. The Tau, having learned from Hive Fleet Gorgon what it costs to fight a Tyranid force without understanding it, have developed new weapons and doctrine specifically informed by that experience. Their technological adaptability, the quality that made them such a challenging opponent for Gorgon to adapt against, is being applied to developing anti-Tyranid countermeasures at a rate that, while slower than the hive mind's biological adaptation, has the advantage of not requiring them to die to test each iteration. The broader Imperium, in the wake of the Great Rift and the Fourth Tyrannic War, is mobilizing on a scale that would have been unimaginable before the wars began. Thousands of Astra Militarum regiments raised specifically for Tyranid operations. Dozens of Space Marine chapters redirected from other theaters. New fortress worlds constructed at strategic choke points. The industrial output of entire sectors directed toward the production of weapons that work against the swarm's specific characteristics. All of this is real. All of it represents genuine progress in the galaxy's ability to respond to the Tyranid threat. And none of it has changed the fundamental strategic situation, which is that the hive fleets encountered so far are advance elements of something larger, and every defender who has ever faced the swarm has done so knowing that what they stopped was not the main course. The achievement of survival should not be understated. Survival is not nothing. It is, against this particular threat, the rarest and most costly achievement imaginable. Every world that still exists, every civilization that has endured, every generation that has been born into a galaxy where the Tyranids have not yet reached, represents the cumulative result of that survival. The galaxy fights on. It continues to fight. That is what it has achieved, and in the context of what it is fighting against, that matters. Part 17. The question without an answer. The honest ending of any serious examination of the Tyranid threat in Warhammer 40,000 is to acknowledge the question that the lore raises and does not answer, and to explain why not answering it is the right creative choice. Can the galaxy survive the Tyranids? Not the specific hive fleets encountered so far. Those have been survived, at cost. The question is whether the galaxy can survive what the lore implies is coming, the main body of an invasion force that treats the hive fleets encountered so far as scouts and advance elements. The lore does not answer this question, and there is a profound creative logic to that refusal. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting defined by genuine, unresolvable darkness. It is not a world where the heroes ultimately prevail and goodness triumphs. It is a world where extraordinarily brave, competent, and devoted people fight every day to hold back horrors that are ultimately uncontainable, achieving temporary victories that buy time, knowing that the time they buy may not be enough, and fighting anyway, because the alternative is not fighting at all. The survival of every world defended, every generation protected, every sacrifice that bought another century of existence for the things worth protecting. Those are the victories this universe offers. Not finality. Not triumph. Survival, bought at great cost, for another day. The Tyranids are perfectly suited to this aesthetic. They are the threat that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be morally condemned, cannot be recruited or converted or scared off. They are the inexorable force that every 40K defender knows is coming, that every sacrifice is made in service of holding at bay, that gives every act of heroism and every tactical victory its full weight, because the alternative to that victory is very specifically understood. The galaxy fights with the full awareness of what fighting means and what losing means, and that awareness is what gives the stories their gravity. So, when a Space Marine stands in the path of a Tyranid swarm, knowing he will die, and holds anyway, because his death will buy enough time for a particular transmission to reach its destination, that act carries its full weight because the setting refuses to promise that it will be enough. It might not be. The transmission might save the planet, and the planet might hold, and the next generation might be born into a system that still exists. Or the swarm might come back, larger and better adapted, and the planet might fall a century later. The individual sacrifice is meaningful in itself, regardless. The 40K universe trusts its audience to understand that meaning does not require a guaranteed outcome. The Tyranids are strong in exactly the way they need to be to serve this purpose. Not so strong that resistance is pointless, because resistance must have meaning and stories require the possibility of difference, but strong enough that no victory is ever final, no defensive line is ever permanently secure, no generation ever gets to stop watching the dark between the stars. That balance, between powerful enough to be genuinely threatening and limited enough that courage and sacrifice produce real effects, is what makes the Tyranids one of the great fictional threats in science fiction. They are not simply monsters. They are the shape that the universe's indifference takes when it arrives wearing claws. And somewhere in the dark, outside the galaxy, the main body moves closer, patient as geological time, hungry as the void, carrying within itself the accumulated learning of every world it has ever consumed, and every species that ever tried to stop it. The galaxy holds. For now, the question of, for how much longer is yours to sit with? Part 18. The lesser-known hive fleets and what they tell us. Beyond the three great tyrannic wars and their associated hive fleets, the history of Tyranid incursions into the galaxy includes a number of smaller fleets, splinter organizations, and regional invasions that receive less attention, but collectively paint a more complete picture of the threat's scope and variety. Hive Fleet Naga arrived earlier than the main fleets in lore chronology, in 801 of the 41st millennium, targeting worlds in the eastern fringe north of the Tau Empire, destroying countless smaller civilizations and consuming several Ildari worlds before being destroyed in 812. The effort required to stop it was substantial. Combined forces from the craft worlds of Idhare, Iyanden, and Malantai, three separate Ildari navies, cooperating at significant cost to each. What the Tyranids gained from that engagement, the genetic libraries of three distinct Ildari populations and their responses to the swarm, flowed back to the hive mind and became part of the knowledge base that later fleets could draw upon when facing Ildari opponents. Hive Fleet Dagon is believed to be a splinter of Behemoth, the organisms that escaped the Battle of Macragge and the Circe ambush, growing in the decades that followed by consuming poorly defended frontier worlds far from the major war zones. By the time it made its presence definitively known in the Jericho Reach, it had grown into a force, requiring the full commitment of the Deathwatch garrison and significant Astra Militarum support to contain. It has not been destroyed. It is ongoing in the lore, steadily consuming the Reach, while the larger wars attract most available military resources elsewhere. Hive Fleet Hydra presents a fascinating doctrinal variant. Where most fleets focus on quality of adaptation or weight of numbers, Hydra specializes in reproductive speed, generating new organisms at rates that exceed even normal Tyranid fecundity. Where other fleets might take time to process consumed biomass before new organisms can be produced, Hydra can replenish its losses with remarkable speed, making it particularly dangerous in prolonged engagements where attritional tactics that would exhaust other forces simply create more Hydra. The specific genetic heritage Hydra drew upon to develop this capability, and what it is building towards strategically, is not clearly established in the lore. It fights differently from the other named fleets, and that difference is a data point about how diverse the hive mind's strategic repertoire actually is. Hive Fleet Kronos has already been mentioned in the context of adaptation, but its existence also tells us something about the hive mind's relationship with chaos that goes beyond the tactical. The fact that a specific fleet has been produced with characteristics oriented specifically around disrupting demonic presence and chaos operations suggests that the hive mind views chaos as a significant enough operational competitor to justify dedicated fleet doctrine against it. This is not a small thing. The Chaos Gods are among the most ancient and powerful entities in the setting. The fact that the hive mind has produced a fleet that treats them as a problem to be specifically countered, rather than an obstacle to be routed around, tells you something about the hive mind's confidence in its ability to address even divine-tier obstacles. The Tiamat system is perhaps the most mysterious of all Tyranid-related locations, a system of worlds that shares common genetic ancestry across all its life forms, where the life has developed ways of moving between worlds to seed new territory. That was quarantined by Adeptus Mechanicus explorators, who correctly identified the danger of spreading it to the wider Imperium. The system lies in territory subsequently swept by Hive Fleet Kraken. The primary base of operations on the jungle world of Zeophoria has begun to be, as the Ordo Xenos terms it, tyranno-formed, converted into a massive biomechanical psychic resonator, whose purpose the Inquisition does not yet understand. This is not simply consumption. Something is being built there, or grown, or prepared. What the hive mind intends with Tiamat is a deliberate mystery in the lore, and the mysteries the lore is most committed to maintaining are always worth paying close attention to. Part 19. The Star Child and Other Speculative Responses. Among those in the Imperium who think most deeply about the Tyranid threat and what can be done about it, there are various speculative theories about responses that might eventually prove viable on a strategic scale, as opposed to the tactical and operational responses that have so far defined the wars. The most discussed of these, though it remains in the realm of deep speculation even by the standards of characters within the lore, concerns the Emperor of Mankind himself. The Emperor is entombed on the Golden Throne, maintained in a state between life and death by the constant sacrifice of psychers, his physical body long since incapable of conventional action, but his psychic presence still the most powerful single psychic entity humanity has ever produced. Some scholars of the arcane, reading the tarot of the Astronomicon, believe that the Emperor's eventual death, when the Golden Throne finally fails, would not be the end of the Emperor's presence, but its transformation. A psychic rebirth into the warp, a divine entity of unprecedented power. Some among these scholars speculate that such an entity might be able to do to the hive mind what the hive mind's shadow in the warp does to individual psychers: overwhelm it, silence it, break its coordination entirely. The hive mind is a psychic phenomenon. An entity of sufficient psychic magnitude in the warp might be able to interfere with it at the foundational level. This is, in the current lore state, speculation and not established fact. But the Imperium has been in situations before where the impossible turned out to be necessary and discovered a way to make it possible. Whether this represents wishful thinking or genuine prophetic insight is something the lore does not resolve. The Inari faction among the Aeldari represents another potentially significant development. The god Yinid, the Aeldari deity of the dead, is said in Aeldari theology to contain within itself the accumulated spiritual energy of every Aeldari soul lost since the fall. If Inyad ever fully awakens, the resulting psychic explosion would, in Aldari belief, destroy Slanesh, the chaos god born from the fall who hungers for Aldari souls. Some interpretations of Aeldari foresight suggest that a fully awakened Yinnyad might also be capable of acting against the hive mind, a death god whose power grows with every death, bringing a psychic force to bear that might interact with the hive mind's consumption of souls in unpredictable and potentially devastating ways. These remain speculative in the lore. The 40K setting is not one that generally resolves its open questions in optimistic directions, but they exist as narrative possibilities that the setting's authors have planted deliberately, which means they are worth considering as part of the full picture of where this story might eventually go. Part 20. The Sound of the Swarm. What makes Tyranids compelling as fiction? A video about the Tyranids that does not spend some time on why they work as a storytelling element would be missing something important, because the question of how strong they are in the lore is inseparable from the question of what they are designed to do to the audience that engages with the fiction. The Tyranids are, in functional terms, a force of nature, given the shape of an army. They occupy a similar narrative space to forces that fantasy and science fiction have used throughout their histories: the barbarian horde at the gates, the ancient malevolence stirring in the deep places of the world, the plague that cannot be reasoned with. But they do this with a specificity and biological coherence that elevates them beyond those archetypes into something genuinely original. The biological creativity that has gone into the Tyranid design space over the decades of 40K's development is extraordinary. Every bioform has a clear ecological role, a specific function within the swarm's economy that makes sense in terms of biological design principles. The Rippers as consumption organisms, processing battlefield detritus and returning biomass to the fleet. The Gaunts as high-volume assault organisms, numerous and fast, and individually disposable, their purpose to overwhelm defenses with mass, rather than to survive and be reused. The Warriors as the nervous system of the ground assault, synapse creatures whose survival is what makes the other organisms function. The Carnifex as the blunt instrument, the thing you send when the objective needs to be removed from physical existence. The Lictor as the thing you never see until it is too late. Each of these design decisions creates specific tactical interactions that generate interesting stories. The vulnerability of the swarm to synapse disruption creates the stories of specialist kill teams going after warriors behind the lines while the main force holds the assault. The Genestealer cult creates the horror story of the civilization that was already compromised before the fleet arrived. The hive mind's adaptation creates the story of commanders trying to innovate fast enough to stay ahead of a learning curve that never stops. What the Tyranids do exceptionally well as a fictional threat is that they remain threatening without becoming comically omnipotent. They can be fought. Individual battles can be won against them. Clever tactics applied at cost produce genuine results. The synapse vulnerability is real. The hive ship targeting doctrine works. The Genestealer cult, once identified, can be purged. None of these victories is permanent, but they are real, which means the stories of people achieving them carry genuine weight. An omnipotent threat generates nihilism. A weak threat generates complacency. The Tyranids exist in exactly the space between those that allows genuine heroism, a threat that can be fought, that individual courage and tactical brilliance genuinely affect. But that is large enough and patient enough that no individual victory changes the fundamental strategic calculus. This is the precise recipe for the kind of tragic heroism that makes 40K's best stories work. Part 21. Living in the 41st Millennium. The civilian experience of Tyranid threat. The military accounts of the Tyrannic wars tell one part of the story. The experience of ordinary people, the billions of civilians who live on worlds in the path of the swarm or adjacent to the war zones, tells another part that the lore addresses unevenly, but with moments of genuine power. On most worlds throughout Ultramar and the broader Eastern Fringe, the awareness of Tyranid threat exists at different levels of clarity and accuracy. The Administratum and the Church do their work of managing information carefully, and the narrative fed to most people is that the Tyranids are a Xenos threat, being managed by the Emperor's mighty warriors. This is not entirely false. It is just so incomplete that it might as well be. The worlds closest to known hive fleet trajectories are different. The populations of worlds in the Cryptus system, the Blood Angels' shield worlds that held back Leviathan's advance toward Baal in the decades before the devastation, knew clearly what they were defending against, and chose to stay and defend it anyway. Dante's preparations included fortifying these worlds with the understanding that they would be sacrificed to slow the advance, and the people who lived on them understood this too. The accounts of the Cryptus campaign describe civilian populations organizing their own defenses, manufacturing weapons with whatever industrial capacity they had, fighting alongside Astra Militarum and Space Marine forces in the full knowledge of what was coming. What drives that kind of choice? The Tyranids offer no possibility of negotiation, no terms under which surrender might preserve anything. There is no collaborationist option, no accommodation that spares the collaborators, because the swarm does not make accommodations. The only meaningful choices are fight or flee, and for many people flee is not available, so they fight, often with weapons and training entirely insufficient to the task, because the alternative to fighting is simply waiting to be consumed. The accounts of planetary defenders who survived Tyranid encounters, extracted before the fall of their world or successfully defending worlds that held, describe a specific aftermath experience. The survivor's specific guilt of having made it when others did not, combined with the knowledge that what they survived was only one encounter with something that will return more capable. There is no triumphant resolution in those accounts. There is the fact of continued existence, which is what they fought for, and the uncertain future, and the knowledge of what the cost of that existence was. This is the civilian experience of the 41st Millennium's Tyranid Wars, and it mirrors in miniature the broader strategic situation. You survive, the threat continues, you prepare for its return. This is what living in the shadow of the Great Devourer actually means for the people who cannot leave, cannot fight at the galactic strategic level, cannot do anything except hold what they are responsible for holding, and accept that the holding may not be permanent. Part 22. What makes the hive fleets different from each other? It is worth clarifying something that might get lost in a survey of the major tyrannic wars. The named hive fleets are not interchangeable. Each has a distinct character that emerged from the specific history of its development and the specific opponents it has faced most extensively. Behemoth, the first to arrive, fought in a fundamentally direct way. No subtlety in its berserker advance, as the lore describes it. A single concentrated thrust toward the highest density of biomass, relying on mass and momentum rather than tactical sophistication. This was the approach of a fleet that had no specific intelligence about how the Imperium fought, because it had not yet fought the Imperium. It brought what it had developed against whatever it consumed before reaching the Milky Way, and while that was formidable, it was not tailored to the specific challenges of this galaxy's defenders. Kraken arrived having processed everything Behemoth learned before its destruction. The multi-tendril approach was not random innovation, but a specific response to the demonstrated effectiveness of concentrated Imperial defense. If you cannot defend against 10 simultaneous attacks as effectively as you can defend against one, make 10 simultaneous attacks. Kraken also made greater use of tunneling organisms and outflanking maneuvers, suggesting it had incorporated the tactical intelligence gathered from every ground engagement. Behemoth fought and designed its assault organisms accordingly. Leviathan came from a direction no one had been watching, came in the largest numbers yet encountered, and approached in a jaw formation that created strategic isolation across entire sectors rather than just individual systems. It also generated more complex and diverse adaptive responses than Behemoth, suggesting that the genetic library available to it was larger, enriched by everything Kraken had consumed and transmitted back before its defeat. Gorgon, though smaller than the major fleets, showed a rate of adaptation during combat that surpassed all previous fleets, producing more bioform variations in a single campaign than any other fleet in recorded history. Whether this was unique to Gorgon or a response to the Tau's unusual combination of sophisticated technology and tactical flexibility, creating an opponent that required faster iteration to counter, is debated. Kronos showed deliberate strategic doctrine focused specifically on one class of enemy, suggesting a level of planning at the hive mind level that goes beyond reactive adaptation and into proactive strategic design. An entire fleet built to address a specific operational environment. If Kronos represents a fleet type rather than a unique fleet, the hive mind's strategic toolkit is considerably broader than any single encounter suggests. The lesson in this diversity is that knowing how to fight one hive fleet does not fully prepare you for the next one. The Ultramarines' deep knowledge of anti-Tyranid operations is an enormous asset. But Leviathan's approach from below the galactic plane, a direction no previous threat had come from, and that Ultramarine doctrine was not specifically prepared for, demonstrates that institutional knowledge of past encounters does not constitute complete preparation for future ones. The hive mind will always eventually try something that has not been tried before, because trying new things is what directed evolution at the strategic level produces. Part 23. The Tyranids in relation to the other great threats. Warhammer 40,000 does not present the Tyranids in isolation. They exist in a setting with a dozen other major threats, some of which have their own complex interactions with the Great Devourer. Understanding the Tyranids fully requires understanding how they relate to the other powers of the galaxy. The relationship between the Tyranids and Chaos is perhaps the most complex and the most significant for the long-term trajectory of the setting. Chaos and the Tyranids represent two fundamentally different categories of cosmic threat. One internal to the galaxy, embedded in the warp, and reflecting the psychic output of every conscious being within it. The other external, a physical biological force that operates entirely within real space and has no truck with the psychic dimension at all. These categories interact in ways that are mutually problematic. Chaos needs souls to feed on, to corrupt, to torture, and transform. Tyranid invasion removes souls from the galaxy at an enormous rate, consuming them along with everything else, denying the Chaos gods the spiritual fuel they depend on. The hive mind's shadow in the warp also actively disrupts demonic manifestation, making it difficult for Chaos forces to operate in areas where the swarm is active. From the Chaos god's perspective, the Tyranids are a competitor, consuming the resource they require. The Tyranids, for their part, cannot consume Chaos-saturated material. The raw matter of Chaos offers no nourishment. Warp-corrupted flesh cannot be processed by Tyranid digestive biology. Heavily chaos-tainted worlds provide less usable biomass than their apparent biological richness would suggest. The Great Rift that tore the galaxy in half after the 13th Black Crusade created enormous regions of warp-heavy space that hive fleets find operationally difficult. This creates a dynamic that is not quite opposition and not quite mutual destruction, but a complicated kind of resource competition where each force is structurally limited in the other's territory. The Octarius War demonstrated how this plays out when the Tyranids and another major threat meet directly. Both grow stronger, neither is destroyed. The galaxy is worse off for the encounter. Whether something similar might eventually force a more direct confrontation between Tyranid and Chaos forces at the strategic scale is a question the setting raises without answering. The Necrons represent a different kind of relationship, ancient beyond measure, with weapons that operate on principles no other faction in the setting has replicated. The Necrons have faced biological threats before. The old ones, the great biological engineers whose war with the Necrons in the deep past shaped the galaxy's current state, use Tyranid-like biological constructs, among other weapons. The Necrons developed specific responses to biological warfare in that ancient conflict. Whether those responses remain relevant to modern hive fleets is unclear, but the knowledge exists in the Necrons' preserved memory in a way that it does not in any other faction's archives. Notably, Hive Fleet Behemoth made specific course corrections to avoid conflict with a Necron tomb world whose defenses it apparently identified as too costly to engage, allowing certain tendrils of the fleet to lapse into hibernation rather than face the awakened Necrons. The Tyranids may not avoid many things. They apparently avoid Necron tombs when the calculus does not favor engagement. What that tells you about the Necrons' real capability in this context is a data point worth keeping. Part 24. Looking forward where the story goes. In the current 10th edition timeline, the Fourth Tyrannic War is underway, and the strategic situation is more complex than it has ever been. The Great Rift has divided the galaxy into two halves, the Imperium Sanctus on one side where the light of the Astronomicon reaches, and the Imperium Nihilus on the other where it does not. Robut Guilliman, resurrected Primarch and Imperial Regent, commands the Indomitus Crusade attempting to push back the darkness on both sides. Hive Fleet Leviathan, its newest tendrils designated Nautilon, Promothor, and Grendilus, is attacking the Segmentum Pacificus from above and below the galactic plane simultaneously, while the Imperium's attention is divided between chaos, Xenos incursions, and the internal political instability generated by the formation of the Rift. The timing is, from the Hive Mind's perspective, optimal. The galaxy's defenders are at their most stretched, their communication networks are most disrupted, and their ability to concentrate force against a specific threat is most limited. What this means for the setting's future trajectory is not established in current releases beyond what the Fourth Tyrannic War supplements have addressed. The 10th edition Tyranids Codex presents the conflict as ongoing and not resolved. Multiple worlds in the Segmentum Pacificus have already fallen. The tendrils continue to advance. The defenders are fighting on multiple fronts with insufficient resources, which is the defining condition of 40K's setting in every era. The stories being told within this conflict are the stories this video has been about, individual acts of heroism and sacrifice that change specific outcomes without changing the fundamental strategic pressure. A kill team that takes out a Norn Queen, buying a specific world a few more months before the next wave. A regiment that holds a defensive line against odds that should have broken it, giving a city enough time to evacuate before the consumption begins. A chapter master who understands the tactical situation better than the hive mind anticipated and exploits a window of vulnerability that closes as soon as it is identified. These stories are possible. They happen. They are the victories the setting offers. The question of whether they add up to enough is what the Fourth Tyrannic War will eventually answer, in the way that 40K answers questions, ambiguously, at cost, without final resolution. The galaxy will survive, or it will not. And if it survives, it will be because people chose to make it survive, at whatever price that choice demanded. That is where the Tyranid story currently stands. The hunger has no end. The answer to it is the choice to fight despite knowing that. And somehow, across 4 tyrannic wars and uncountable smaller engagements and the slow, grinding pressure of a threat that encompasses entire galaxies and is still coming, the galaxy has made that choice every time it needed to be made. Whether it continues to make it is the story that is still being written. Part 25. The Hive Fleet as Ecosystem, Understanding the Biological Logic. One of the most remarkable things about the Tyranids as a fictional creation is the degree to which their biology follows a coherent internal logic. If you strip away the grimdark framing and approach them as a xenobiologist might, they represent an extraordinarily sophisticated answer to the evolutionary question of how a species might optimize for pure consumption at galactic scale. Every element of their biology serves the same ultimate purpose: maximum efficient conversion of external organic material into more Tyranids. The Gaunts exist to overwhelm defenses through mass, accepting high casualties because they are cheap to produce, and the biomass cost of losing them is acceptable if the result is access to more biomass than they represent. The larger predatory bioforms exist to remove the obstacles that mass alone cannot handle. The synapse creatures exist to ensure the mass assault is directed rather than random. The Norn Queens exist to process the gained biomass and produce the next wave. Every element of the system feeds into every other element, creating a closed loop that becomes more efficient with each world consumed. This biological logic extends to the fleet scale. The hive ships serve simultaneously as transport, production, and processing facility. They carry the population to the next food source, produce the organisms needed to consume it, and process what is consumed into the material needed to produce more organisms and fuel the next voyage. The fleet is a self-contained ecological system with a single input, consumed organic material, and a single output, more fleet. The adaptation mechanism is the most impressive component from a biological design perspective. Natural ecosystems have their own adaptive logic, where species evolve to fill available niches and defensive populations develop responses to predator pressure over time. The Tyranids accelerate this process by centralizing the genetic library, maintaining and continuously updating it, and applying directed design rather than random variation to the specific problems encountered. It is as if natural selection operated not at the population level over generations, but at the individual level in real time, identifying optimal responses immediately rather than probabilistically over time. The implications of this for every species that has ever encountered the Tyranids and survived is that the species has contributed something specific to the hive mind's library. Human DNA is in there, drawn from the billions consumed across the tyrannic wars and the smaller engagements before them. The distinctive and potent Blood Angels gene seed that drew Leviathan to Baal, now incorporated into the library after the devastation. Eldari genetics, from Eondon, and from every smaller engagement. Necron-derived material, if any was recovered from the Tomb World encounters. Tau biology from the Gorgon campaign. Orc material from the Octarius War. The hive mind's current genetic library is richer than it has ever been because the diversity of species it has encountered in the Milky Way is greater than anything available in the intergalactic void it crossed to get here. The galaxy's biological diversity, the product of billions of years of separate evolutionary histories across hundreds of civilizations, is being absorbed and cataloged and made available for incorporation into future bioforms. The galaxy is, in a very specific and horrible sense, making the Tyranids better by existing. Part 26. The mathematics of survival numbers that are hard to hold. Let us talk about numbers for a moment, because the scale of the Tyranid threat is one of those things that is technically knowable, but genuinely difficult to hold in the mind as a meaningful concept. The hive fleet above Baal brought over 50,000 bioships. This is the fleet that the Blood Angels, with 21 battle barges and 94 strike cruisers and hundreds of smaller vessels, went up against. Space Marine chapter vessels are not ordinary ships. A battle barge is an enormous, heavily armed warship capable of supporting planetary invasions. The Blood Angels fleet represented an extraordinary concentration of Space Marine naval power by any conventional standard. Against 50,000 bioships, it was swept aside. The Strategic Collective's assessment of the full mobilization required to defend against what is coming describes it in terms of every able-bodied person in 3 segmentums of the galaxy. 3 segmentums. The Imperium is divided into 5 segmentums, each containing vast swaths of the galaxy, containing thousands of inhabited worlds, with populations ranging from a few million to, on the Great Hive worlds, over 100 billion. 3 of the 5. Every person. And the report says that would give a chance of survival, not a guarantee. The total population of the Imperium is estimated in lore at somewhere between 100 billion and a trillion people, depending on which figures and which edition's estimates you use. Even at the lower end of those estimates, 3 segmentums represents a mobilization of tens of billions of soldiers, crews, and support personnel. The industrial output of thousands of Forge worlds, the full commitment of hundreds of Space Marine chapters, and the entire Astra Militarum. Everything. And this is against what the Strategic Collective believes to be the advance elements. The main body of the Tyranid invasion, still in transit through the intergalactic void, is of unknown scale. The lore has consistently declined to specify it, which is the correct creative choice, because any number given would immediately become a hard limit that future lore would need to respect or contradict. What the lore does is describe the advance elements as being large enough to require full mobilization of 3 segmentums to defend against, and then note that these are not the main event. The implication is clear without being made specific. The main body makes the advance elements look like what they are, which is scouts. These numbers are not really numbers in the sense that makes experience comprehensible. They are placeholders for something too large for human cognition to engage with directly, which is exactly what the hive mind is designed to represent. The individual human experience of a Tyranid war, as terrifying as it is genuinely inadequate to grasp what the hive mind is. The scale at which it operates, the number of organisms it comprises, the volume of biomass it can process, the duration over which it has been functioning, these are galaxy-scale phenomena, and the human brain that evolved to navigate social groups of a few hundred people is not equipped to hold them accurately. This gap between the scale of the threat and the scale of the experience of fighting it is one of the things that makes the Tyranids so effective dramatically. The individual soldier, the Space Marine chapter, the sector commander, all of them are experiencing something that is a tiny fraction of the actual event, fighting a war that is simultaneously intimate and galactic, personal and cosmic, urgent and geological. The contrast between the human scale of the experience and the inhuman scale of the threat is where much of the emotional power of Tyranid lore lives. Part 27. The Role of Faith. What belief can and cannot do against the swarm. In Warhammer 40,000, faith is not simply a metaphor. The psychic reality of the warp means that the collective belief of billions of people in the divine emperor of mankind genuinely, physically, affects reality. The Astronomicon burns because the Emperor's psychic power is real. The Space Marines are what they are, partly because the Emperor's genetic genius created them. Chaos gods exist because the psychic output of conscious beings created them. In this universe, belief is a material force. Against the Tyranids, this is a more complicated proposition than it might seem. The shadow in the warp disrupts psyker abilities. It disrupts astropathic communication. Does it also disrupt the psychic components of faith-based phenomena? The answer in the lore appears to be yes, to a degree. Battle prayers that might normally produce a measurable psychic effect are attenuated in areas where the shadow is strong. Chaplains who lead their warriors in litanies of the Emperor's greatness before battle find the psychological effect of those litanies somewhat diminished when the words are spoken under the alien weight of the hive mind's presence. Something about the nature of the hive mind's psychic signature makes it specifically difficult to maintain the focused collective belief that empowers the Imperium's faith-based abilities. This is not a simple counter to faith, because faith in 40K is also about morale, about the will to fight, about the stories a person tells themselves about why what they are doing matters. These are not purely psychic phenomena. They are human phenomena, and the Tyranids have no counter to them except the pressure of numbers and inevitability, which has never been sufficient to break every defender in every situation. The Ultramarines' first company at Macragge did not stop fighting when the situation became hopeless. The Knights of Blood at Baal threw themselves into the swarm while fully consumed by the black rage, fighting to the last, not from tactical calculation, but from something that has no name in the Tyranids' biological vocabulary. The chaplains of every chapter that has fought the swarm will tell you that faith matters in ways that tactical analysis cannot fully capture. Not because faith alters the biological reality of how many gaunts the swarm contains, or how fast the hive mind adapts, but because faith is what makes it possible for people to do what the situation requires of them when the situation is impossible, and the situations the Tyranids create are routinely impossible. The soldier who holds the defensive line for 5 more minutes, while knowing those 5 minutes will cost everything, holding them because there are people behind that line who need those 5 minutes, is not performing a tactical calculation. They are expressing something that the hive mind has no framework for and cannot factor into its optimization. That expression does not change the strategic outcome. It changes the tactical outcome, sometimes. Sometimes 5 minutes is enough. And in those cases, the faith that made someone stay 5 minutes longer when everything said to run is the thing that made the difference between a world surviving and a world falling. Part 28. A personal note on the Tyranids and what they mean. Before the final section of this video, I want to step slightly outside the lore for a moment, because I think there is something worth saying directly. The Tyranids, as a piece of fiction, resonate for reasons that go beyond their clever biology and their impressive threat scale. They resonate because they are a very specific metaphor, given claws and chitin and terrifying scale. The idea of a threat so vast that no individual can meaningfully address it, so persistent that victories against it produce no security, so alien that the usual frameworks for understanding enemies do not apply, that is not simply a science fiction concept. It is an experience that many people have with the large, impersonal forces that shape their lives. Economic systems too large to hold accountable. Environmental processes too massive to reverse through individual action. Health conditions that press in regardless of how much effort is applied against them. The feeling of being small in the face of something that does not register you as anything other than material is not exotic. It is familiar. What 40K does with this feeling is refuse the easy resolution. It does not tell you that belief in yourself is enough, that if you believe hard enough, the tide will turn, that the heroes ultimately win because they are heroes. What it says instead is that you fight anyway. Not because the fight is guaranteed to succeed, not because the universe owes you a victory in exchange for the effort, but because fighting is what conscious beings do in the face of things that would rather they simply stopped existing. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it is enough. There is something genuinely, quietly hopeful in the stories of the Tyrannic Wars, buried under all the darkness and the body counts and the scorched planets. It is not the hope that everything will be fine. It is the hope that conscious choice has meaning, even against forces that do not care about meaning. The Dominus Astra's captain made a choice. The First Company Terminators made a choice. Dante made a choice when he was at the end of his strength and fought the Swarm Lord anyway. None of those choices resolved the threat. All of them mattered. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also this, the unceasing evidence that being human, in whatever form humanity takes under those alien skies, means something. The hive mind cannot account for it. That is the only answer the setting offers, and it is, somehow, enough. Part 29. The Battle for Ichar 4, when Calgar settled a score. The Battle of Ichar 4 deserves more detailed attention than it typically receives, because it illustrates several things about how the Tyranid threat evolves from one war to the next in ways that pure casualty figures do not capture. When Kraken's main thrust drove toward Ichar 4 in the closing phases of the Second Tyrannic War, Marneus Calgar was already there. He had spent years, since the defeat of Behemoth, studying everything that had been learned about the Tyranids, developing and refining the tactical doctrines that he had been forced to improvise at Macragge. He understood the synapse dependency in a way he had not fully understood it during the First War. He understood the bioship targeting priority in a way that had taken the Dominus Astra's sacrifice to demonstrate. He had, in the intervening quarter century, become perhaps the most knowledgeable human strategist on the subject of fighting Tyranids, while the Tyranids had spent those same years incorporating everything they had learned from him. The battle that followed was, in a very real sense, the second meeting of two minds that had already studied each other closely. Calgar applied his doctrine, concentrated heavy firepower on synapse creatures, forcing constant redeployment and disruption of the swarm's coordination, accepting losses in specific areas to create firing lines that could reach hive tyrants and warriors before they could establish stable synapse coverage. The Swarm Lord arrived, as it had at Macragge, carrying everything the hive mind had learned about how Calgar thinks. This time, the outcome was reversed. Calgar killed the Swarm Lord in personal combat. What changed? The Swarm Lord carried forward from Macragge the specific information about Calgar that would have been most dangerous to him: his fighting style, his decision-making patterns under pressure, the specific combination of abilities that had nearly killed the Swarm Lord before. The hive mind had analyzed all of this and made adjustments. But Calgar had also changed, not in his fundamentals, which remained consistent, but in his depth of understanding of the opponent. He knew, going in, that the Swarm Lord would have incorporated lessons from their previous fight. He accounted for those lessons in his approach. He anticipated the adaptations. 2 centuries of specific preparation against a single class of opponent, applied by one of the finest tactical minds in human history, proved sufficient to beat the hive mind's own preparation. That is what HR4 demonstrated. It also demonstrated the absolute cost of that victory. HR4 lay in ruins afterward, the world barely recognizable as inhabited after months of the kind of fighting that Tyranid invasions produce. It survived. Its people did not, or at least not most of them. Part 30. The biological weapons of the Hive Fleet mechanisms and effects. A thorough examination of the Tyranid threat requires spending time on the specific biological weapons the swarm deploys, not just naming the bioforms that carry them, but understanding what those weapons actually do and why they are so difficult to counter. The Fleshborer, the standard ranged weapon carried by termagants, is a living organism housed in a casing that functions as a gun barrel and propellant chamber. The beetle-like creatures it fires are alive when launched, driven by their own limited biological drive toward whatever they strike. When they impact, they do not simply penetrate. They are designed to dig into whatever they hit and continue moving through it, following organic material. Against armor, they work on the seals and gaps rather than the armor itself. Against unarmored targets, they are devastating in a way that is not simply the product of their penetrating power, but of what they continue doing after they penetrate. The Devourer fires a continuous stream of smaller organisms, each of which carries a paralytic or digestive compound, transforming the weapon from a point-damage device into an area saturation biological hazard. A formation caught in sustained Devourer fire does not simply take casualties. It finds its ability to function as a formation degraded by the effects on those not immediately incapacitated. The awareness that what struck your squad mate is also on you, already working. The venom cannon fires pressurized streams of biological acid and venom compounds, capable of penetrating vehicle armor through sustained application. It is not simply a chemical weapon in the traditional sense. The compound is alive, a secretion of organisms living in the weapon symbiote, continuously regenerated as it is expended. The concentration and lethality of the compound can be adjusted by the carrier organism within limits, representing another form of in-engagement adaptation. The Bone Sword and Lash Whip combination carried by hive tyrants and warriors represents the Tyranid approach to melee in its most developed form. The Bone Sword disrupts the nervous system of whatever it strikes, producing effects that go beyond simple cutting damage, to include neurological interference that can stun or disorient even organisms that would otherwise survive the physical wound. The Lash Whip creates a defensive zone around the carrier that makes approaching it difficult, the whip moving faster than most organisms can react to, intercepting close-range attacks before they land. Used together, the combination creates a melee fighter that is difficult to approach, difficult to hurt through normal means, and capable of disabling opponents who manage to get through both defenses. Bioplasma weapons represent the highest energy output available to Tyranid organisms below the Bio-Titan tier. Concentrated blasts of biological plasma capable of breaching armored vehicles at range, produced by specialized organs in the carrying organism. The production of such plasma is biologically costly, requiring significant energy from the carrying organism, which is why it is reserved for the larger and higher priority bioforms that can generate that energy reliably. A sustained bioplasma bombardment from multiple hive tyrants represents an anti-armor capability comparable to dedicated tank-hunting weapons. The toxins and venoms used throughout the Tyranid arsenal represent another category of biological weapons that conventional forces are often poorly prepared for. Unlike chemical weapons that are synthesized and deployed in fixed concentrations, Tyranid biological toxins are produced by living organisms and can vary in composition based on what the hive mind has determined to be most effective against the current opponent. A toxin that worked against unarmored human infantry can, in subsequent waves, be recalibrated for greater penetration through the sealed systems of Space Marine power armor. A venom that affects human biochemistry can be adjusted to affect the distinctly different biochemistry of Tau Fire warriors. There is no standard countermeasure to Tyranid biological weapons because the weapons do not maintain a standard composition. This is one of the most insidious aspects of the biological warfare approach. Every countermeasure developed against a specific Tyranid compound becomes less effective as subsequent waves carry modified versions. Medical corps serving in Tyranid campaigns carry extensive antitoxin libraries and rapidly consume them as each engagement reveals new variants. Part 31. The Death Watch and Anti-Tyranid Operations. No examination of the Tyranid threat would be complete without discussing the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, the body specifically established to deal with Xenos threats at the surgical level. The Death Watch, drawn from across every Space Marine chapter, bringing together diverse capabilities and experience under a unified anti-Xenos doctrine, has become in the post-Behemoth era increasingly focused on the Tyranid threat specifically. The Death Watch's value against Tyranids is not in pitched battle, where even the finest Space Marine warriors cannot match the sheer biological mass the swarm can bring. It is in surgical operations that achieve strategic effects disproportionate to the forces involved. Kill teams tasked with locating and eliminating Norn Queens buried deep within the organic architecture of hive ships have achieved outcomes that denied specific fleets their production capability for months. Teams tasked with Patriarch extraction, finding and killing the Genestealer Patriarch of an established cult before the fleet arrives, have prevented multiple planetary invasions by eliminating the psychic beacon that would have guided the fleet and the internal saboteurs that would have compromised the defense. The experience required for these operations is hard-won and irreplaceable. A Death Watch veteran who has conducted boarding operations against active hive ships carries knowledge that cannot be taught from training manuals or reconstructed from battle reports. The smell of the ship's biological interior, the way the organic corridors respond to movement, the walls themselves registering the presence of foreign organisms and beginning to close defensive responses. The behavior of the specialist defense organisms that bioships produce to repel boarders, distinct from the ground assault organisms and requiring different engagement priorities. The specific pressure points in the ship's biology that, when struck with the right weapons in the right sequence, can cause cascading biological failures that are more disruptive than simply destroying what you can reach. This knowledge is encoded in the living Death Watch veterans who have survived such operations, and their survival rate is not high. Every veteran lost to a Tyranid campaign represents an irreplaceable repository of experiential knowledge walking out of the organizational memory. The Death Watch maintains this knowledge as best it can through its own traditions of detailed after-action reporting and direct knowledge transfer between veterans, but the gap between reading a report and having been there is not fully bridgeable. The Death Watch's role in the current Fourth Tyrannic War encompasses multiple theaters simultaneously, its kill teams distributed across every active front, attempting to apply surgical pressure at the specific vulnerabilities that have been identified. The constraints are always the same: too many fronts, too few teams, too little time between the identification of a high-value target and the window in which it can be reached closing. The hive mind does not offer these windows for long, and the adaptation process means that methods that worked last month may work less well this month. Part 32. The hive mind's patience and the long war. Something that does not fully emerge from engagement by engagement analysis is the hive mind's relationship with time, which is fundamentally different from how any other entity in the galaxy relates to duration. Human commanders, even the longest-lived Space Marine chapter masters who operate across centuries rather than decades, exist within a subjective experience of time that retains urgency. There are things that need to happen now. There are opportunities that will close if not taken immediately. There is a life that is finite, and therefore a career that has stakes shaped by that finitude. Even an Aeldari Farseer, whose lifespan extends to thousands of years, experiences time as something with texture and urgency, as a sequence of moments, each of which matters. The hive mind exists across a span of consciousness that encompasses the entirety of its presence in the Milky Way and everything it processed before arriving. It contains, in some sense, the accumulated experience of fleets that cross the intergalactic void over a period measured in millions of years. When the hive mind makes a decision about how to approach a specific tactical situation, that decision is informed by something that has no human analog, a depth of experiential reference that makes any individual human life seem like a brief flicker. This relationship with time produces tactical patience that goes beyond anything a human commander can replicate or fully account for. The hive mind does not feel pressure to take an opportunity now because it perceives the opportunity as fleeting. If the opportunity closes, it waits for the next one and applies what it learned about why the first one closed. If a strategy is not working, it does not double down out of investment in the strategy. It simply tries something else, without the ego investment in having been right the first time that affects even the finest human decision makers. The Gene Stealer cult infiltration program illustrates this perfectly. Planting a single Gen Stealer on a world and then waiting for the cult to mature across 4 or 5 generations, potentially a span of a century or more, before the fleet arrives to claim the results. This is a planning horizon that most military thinkers, even in 40K, struggle to genuinely incorporate into their defensive calculations. The default assumption of most planetary commanders is that threats are things that will emerge within their tenure. Threats that were planted by their grandparents' generation and will mature under their grandchildren's watch require a different kind of awareness, a different kind of institutional paranoia about the demographic distribution of the population and the genetic markers of hybrid organisms. The Inquisition maintains this paranoia. That is part of why it exists. The systematic hunt for genostealer cults, the surveillance of populations for the slow statistical drift of hybrid characteristics, the aggressive investigation of any community showing unusual behaviors consistent with psychic cohesion under a patriarch's influence. All of this is the institutional response to a threat that thinks on timescales that most defensive planners cannot encompass. And still, cults grow. Because it only takes one genostealer reaching a populated world, and the galaxy is very large, and the Tyranids have been seeding it for a very long time. If you have made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you. This kind of deep dive takes an enormous amount of research and care to put together, and every person who stays until the final word is someone this channel genuinely runs for. Please drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from right now, and what time it is for you. These comments genuinely brighten the days when they come in from somewhere unexpected, and I read every one. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to Q40K. It is free, it keeps the channel going, and it makes sure you do not miss whatever comes next. Until next time.